Hey there, and welcome back. Settle in wherever you happen to be. Let your shoulders come down from wherever they have been holding themselves all day, and let the light in the room go low and easy. This is one of those long, unhurried evenings that exist for one purpose only, which is to carry you somewhere far away and very long ago, somewhere you do not have to do a single thing but lie still and listen. It is for anyone who has carried more than their share this week, for anyone whose mind will not stop turning, for anyone who simply needs the world to slow right down before sleep. Tonight I would like to take you back more than 300 years into the candlelit corridors of the Old English court and walk you slowly through one of the most remarkable lives of that whole age. This is an evening simply to sink into and let it carry you wherever it goes. You can let your eyes close whenever they wish to, and let yourself rest. We are going to meet a girl born in a quiet country house in Hertfordshire, who would rise on nothing but her wit, her beauty, and one extraordinary friendship, to become the most powerful woman in England, who was never herself born to a crown. And we will come in time to a single afternoon on the steps of a great cathedral, with the bells ringing and the crowds roaring, when that friendship of 30 years began in a few whispered words to break apart. Before we step into her world, I want to say one small thing, and then I will not interrupt the quiet again. These slow evenings of history are something I make for exactly this hour of the night, for the winding down and the letting go of the day. If you find that they help you rest, if the sound of a story told gently in the dark is something you would like to find your way back to on another night like this one, then you are always welcome to subscribe and follow along, so that the next of these evenings can come and find you when you need it. There is no hurry in any of it, and there is no demand laid upon you at all. You can stay exactly where you are, warm and untroubled and still, and let me do all the talking from here. That is the whole of it. Now let us go back. Picture this. A house of warm red brick standing among water meadows on the edge of the old town of Saint Albans, in the green county of Hertfordshire, north of London. The River Ver runs near it, slow and shallow over its gravel, and the place takes its name from a holy well that has stood there since the days of monks and pilgrims. It is called Holywell House. The year is 1660, and England is changing its skin. For more than a decade, the country has had no king, has lived under soldiers and stern men, and the long grey discipline of the Commonwealth, and now, that very spring, the old order has come flooding back. Charles II has been welcomed home to his throne amid bonfires and bells and wine running in the conduits, and a whole people half-starved of colour and music and laughter has set about enjoying itself again. It is into this loosened, festive, uncertain new world that a daughter is born in the house by the water on the 5th day of June in the year 1660. Her name is Sarah Jennings, and almost nothing about that quiet birth suggests the height she will one day reach. Saint Albans was an old place even then, a market town grown up around the ruins of a Roman city and the great medieval abbey that gave it its name, a place where the past lay thick under the present, and the Jennings had been people of standing there for a long time, the kind of family whose men served as members of Parliament and whose standing was known the length of the county. But standing is not the same as wealth, and the family's means were modest, and its affairs not always easy. So that the world little Sarah grew into was one in which appearances had to be kept up on an income that did not always stretch to keep them. It was an excellent schooling, though no one intended it as one, for a child who grows up watching her elders manage carefully and worry quietly learns early what things cost and what security is worth. She was born, too, into a country still raw from upheaval, where the wounds of civil war and the killing of one king and the rule of soldiers were within living memory, and the restored monarchy felt new and not yet wholly safe. Beneath the gaiety of the Restoration ran a current of fear, of plots and rumours of plots, of the old religious hatred between Protestant and Catholic that would, before Sarah was 30, tear the throne apart once more. A girl of spirit growing up in such a world absorbed, without being taught it, the lesson that nothing was fixed, that fortunes turned, that the great could fall and the obscure could rise, and that the only safety lay in nerve and in knowing one's own mind. Sarah Jennings absorbed it more deeply than most, and she would live her whole long life as though she had never for a moment forgotten it. The Jennings family were gentry, which is to say they were respectable and old and locally important, and not at all the same thing as being rich or grand. They had held land in Hertfordshire and in Kent for generations. Sarah's father, Richard Jennings, sat in Parliament and managed his estates and his money with the ordinary worries of a country gentleman who has more name than fortune. Her mother was Frances, a woman of strong character, and, it was said, a sharp tongue, qualities her daughter would inherit in full measure and then some. There were several children in the household, and she was one of the younger of those who lived. An elder sister, Frances, named for their mother, was the family beauty of the first rank, and it was Frances who would go to court first, leaving little Sarah at home for a while in the house among the meadows, watching and waiting and learning the shape of her own ambition before she had any word for it. To feel the full distance she would one day travel, it helps to linger a moment on how ordinary her beginnings truly were. The Jennings were comfortable without being wealthy, known in their own corner of Hertfordshire, and not much beyond it. The sort of family that supplied a county with its justices and its members of Parliament, and expected nothing grander for its daughters than a respectable marriage to a neighbouring landowner. Holywell House was no palace, but a pleasant gentleman's residence among gardens and running water, the kind of place where a child learned the turning of the seasons, the management of a household, and the price of things. There was money worry in the background, debts and disputes over the estate, the small anxious arithmetic of a family with more standing than income, and she grew up knowing the value of a pound and the danger of owing one, a lesson she never unlearned. And that would one day help to make her the shrewdest manager of money in the kingdom. Her elder sister went first into the wider world and shone there, so celebrated for her looks that she was remembered as one of the beauties of the age, painted and admired, and talked of at court. That example mattered, for it showed the younger girl that a clever and handsome woman of no fortune might still make her way upward through the one market open to her, the market of the court, where a face and a manner and a ready tongue could be worth more than acres of land. She had taken little from her lessons, for almost no pains were spent on the schooling of girls in her station, and she carried a faint embarrassment about her spelling to the end of her days. But she had learned, watching her sister and her family, and the careful world around her, the things that no schoolroom could teach, how people might be read, how favour moved from hand to hand, and how a person of spirit need not simply accept the lot she had been handed. She was, in short, perfectly fitted for the place she was about to enter, and entirely unfitted to be humble once she was inside it. We should be honest about how little she was given to start with. She received almost no formal education, the kind that was thought wasted on girls in any case in that time. She would be uneasy about her own handwriting and her spelling to the very end of her long life, 80 years and more later, when she was one of the richest women in Europe and could have commanded any tutor in the land. What she had instead was something that no schoolroom could have taught her, and that would carry her further than any amount of Latin. She had a quick, fearless, restless mind. She had a tongue that said exactly what it thought, to anyone, of any rank, without the small hesitations that governed everyone around her. And she had beauty of a striking, clear, fair-haired kind that turned heads in a room and held them. Even as a girl she seems to have understood, without being told that the world could be argued with, that people in high places were only people, and that a woman with nerve and a clear eye need not simply accept the place she was handed. The world she was about to enter was the most glittering and the most dangerous in England, and it lay only a day's ride to the south. The restored court of Charles II was a world of wit and beauty and pleasure, of poets and gamblers and royal mistresses, of fortunes made overnight by a clever word in the right ear, and lost as quickly by a wrong one. Behind the silk and the music, it was also a place of cold calculation, where everything turned on access, on favour, on who could get near the people who mattered and who could not. It was, in other words, a setting that might have been designed for a girl exactly like Sarah Jennings, if only she could find her way in through the door. And the door, when it opened, would open through her sister and through a household that was about to be the making of her, the household of the king's own brother, James, Duke of York, the man who would one day, briefly and disastrously, be king himself. That is exactly where we are going next, into the corridors of that royal household, to watch a girl of barely 13 take her first steps onto the most slippery floor in the kingdom, and to meet, for the first time, two figures who would shape the whole of the rest of her life. One of them was a soldier. The other was a sad, short-sighted, lonely little princess. But before either of them, there was simply the court itself, vast and bewildering and full of eyes, and a young newcomer learning very quickly that she had a gift for it. The way in came, as so much did in that age, through family connection. Sarah's elder sister Frances had gone before her into the service of the Duchess of York, and around the year 1673, when Sarah was about 13 years old, she too was brought to court and placed in that same household. The Duchess of York at this time was Mary of Modena, a young Italian princess, very beautiful and very Catholic, who had just been married to the widowed Duke. James himself was a stiff, brave, humourless man, the king's younger brother, and, since Charles had no legitimate children, the heir to the throne. His household was a court within the court, a smaller world with its own rituals and rivalries, and it was here, among the maids of honour and the ladies of the bedchamber, that Sarah Jennings began her education in the only subjects that would ever truly matter to her, which were power and people, and how the two were joined. Life as a maid of honour was a curious mixture of glamour and hazard, lived in the public eye and judged without mercy. The young women were lodged together within the palace, attended the great ladies through the long rituals of the day, appeared at the masques and the card tables and the suppers where the whole court gathered, and were, in effect, on permanent display before the men who would choose, or seduce, or ruin them. The stakes were high and the falls were hard, for a girl who made a good marriage from such a place might rise for life, while one who made a false step might be sent home in disgrace with her prospects gone, and the difference between the two outcomes often hung on nothing more than reputation and self-command. It was a finishing school in which the only subjects were judgment, nerve, and the reading of other people, and she excelled in all three. She learned the texture of that world in her bones, the etiquette and the gossip, the gambling that consumed fortunes in a night, the constant currents of favour and disfavour that moved beneath the surface of every smile. She learned that the great were merely people, vain and frightened and biddable like everyone else, and that the appearance of indifference to their favour was paradoxically the surest way to win it. Above all, she learned the value of her own unusual armour, her refusal to dissemble, in a place where almost everyone dissembled all the time, where another girl might have schooled herself to flatter and please. She schooled herself in the opposite direction, and the gamble of it, the sheer nerve of being blunt in a world of courtiers, marked her out and carried her, in the end, further than any amount of pleasing could have done. A maid of honour was a young, unmarried woman of good family who attended a great lady, carried her train, sat with her, kept her company, and was on display in the marriage market of the court while she did so. It was a position of honour, as the name says, and also a kind of genteel apprenticeship in courtliness, and for a girl with Sarah's gifts, it was a stage exactly the right size. She was beautiful in a court full of beauties, but she had something the others mostly lacked, which was that she did not seem to be afraid. She spoke her mind to her superiors. She formed strong opinions and defended them with heat. She had a temper, and she had charm, and she had the rare and unsettling quality of appearing to care nothing at all for the good opinion of people she did not respect, which had the perverse effect of making a great many people want her good opinion, very much indeed. In a place where everyone flattered everyone, a young woman who would not flatter stood out like a clear note in a noisy room. The court she had entered was not one building, but a whole crowded town of a palace. The rambling old palace of Whitehall stretched along the river, a warren of lodgings and galleries and privy gardens, where some 2,000 people lived and worked and intrigued under one vast tangle of roofs. To find a place there was to enter a kind of perpetual theatre in which everyone was always being watched and judged, in which a reputation could be made by a witty remark at supper and destroyed by a careless one, and in which a young unmarried woman walked a particularly narrow line. The maids of honour were prized and exposed in equal measure, displayed for advantageous marriage yet surrounded by men who hunted them for sport, and more than one promising girl had been ruined by a seduction or a scandal and sent home in disgrace. She watched all of this with a cool and early-wise eye, and she guarded herself with a sharpness that some mistook for coldness, and that was in truth a kind of armour. What set her apart was a quality the court found genuinely unsettling, which was that she could not be bought with flattery and would not pay in it. She formed her judgments quickly and held them stubbornly. She said what she thought to people far above her in rank, and she seemed almost to enjoy the alarm this caused. In an air thick with compliment and calculation, her bluntness had the force of something rare, and it drew people to her even as it made enemies, for there is a particular fascination in the one person in a flattering room who will tell you the truth. She was building, without quite intending it, the reputation that would define her whole life, that of a woman who could not be managed, who answered back, who meant exactly what she said. It was a dangerous reputation to have at a court that ran on smooth dishonesty, and it was the foundation of everything she would become. It was in this household, when she was still only a girl, that Sarah first came to know the person who would become the centre of her life for 30 years. Among the children of the Duke of York was his younger daughter, the Princess Anne. Anne was a few years younger than Sarah, a plump, quiet, short-sighted child, often unwell, often overlooked, standing always in the shadow of her elder sister Mary. Anne was not clever in the way Sarah was clever, and she was not beautiful, and she was painfully shy, and she suffered all her life from poor eyesight that made her seem to peer out at the world from somewhere far inside herself. What she had, and what almost no one troubled to notice, was a deep and lonely capacity for love, a need to fasten her whole heart onto one person and to be loved entirely in return. When that quiet, neglected princess looked at the dazzling, fearless, golden-haired older girl who attended her stepmother, something in her reached out and held on, and did not let go for the better part of 3 decades. We will follow that bond very closely, because it is the engine of this whole story. But its full flowering was still some years off, and before it came, she had her own heart to lose, to a young man with no money and very good legs and an ambition every bit as fierce as her own. His name was John Churchill, and when she first came to notice him, he was one of the most admired young men at the court of Charles II. He was about 10 years older than she was, the son of a royalist gentleman from Devon whose family had been ruined in the civil wars for their loyalty to the crown, and who had nothing to leave his son but a good name and a debt of gratitude owed by the restored king. John had been given a place as a page in the household of the Duke of York, and from there he had gone into the army, and in the army he had found the thing he was made for. He was brave to a degree that struck even hardened soldiers as remarkable, cool under fire, courteous, careful, and quietly, relentlessly determined to rise. He was also, by every account that survives, beautiful to look at, with an easy grace of manner that charmed men and women alike. He had served abroad, he had won notice and promotion, and he had already passed through one famous entanglement, having been for a time the lover of one of the king's own mistresses, an affair that had brought him a sum of money he had wisely turned into an annuity rather than spending it, which tells you a good deal about the kind of man he was. He was poor, he was ambitious, and he was looking, as a man in his position had to look, for a marriage that would advance him. He had earned his early reputation the hard way, in the field. As a very young man he had served abroad in the wars, learning his trade under the great French commanders of the day and in the sea fights and sieges of the time, and he had shown from the first that rare and quiet courage that does not flinch and does not boast. Soldiering was the one sure ladder for a man of his birth, with nothing behind him but a ruined family's loyalty, and he climbed it steadily, gaining notice, gaining rank, gaining the small fortune that a careful officer could put by. He was already marked by those who watched such things as a man with a future, and such a man was expected to crown it with a rich wife. There was behind the romance of his marriage the cold fact of his family's hopes for his people, wished him to repair their fortunes by wedding the great heiress, whose money would have set him up for life, and for one so poor and so ambitious to turn from her to a portionless beauty was by the reckoning of the age something close to folly. That he did it anyway tells us that beneath the cool and calculating surface of the future general there ran a vein of real and stubborn feeling, and that Sarah Jennings had reached something in him that ambition could not touch. It tells us, too, that the partnership which would carry them both to the heights was founded not on advantage, but on a genuine and tested love, and that may be why it held, where so many grander marriages of that world cracked and fell apart through 40 years of fortune and disaster alike. That is what makes what happened between him and Sarah Jennings so worth pausing over. By every rule of the world they both lived in, they should not have married each other at all. He needed money, and she had almost none. She was a younger daughter of a gentry family in financial difficulty, with a small portion at best, and a marriage to her could do nothing for a young officer's fortunes. John Churchill had every reason to look elsewhere, and for a while it seems that he, or at least his family, did. There was talk of a match with Catherine Sedley, a great heiress, plain but immensely rich, exactly the sort of bride that cold good sense would have chosen for an ambitious man with his way to make in the world. His parents pressed him hard towards money. It is hard, from this distance, to feel how radical their choice really was, for we are used to the idea that people marry where they love, and they were not. In their day, a marriage among the propertied classes was first of all a treaty, a joining of estates and interests negotiated between families with an eye to advantage, and love, if it came at all, was expected to follow the contract rather than to make it. For a rising young officer to set aside a fortune and marry for affection was to flout the whole settled wisdom of his class, and to do it for a woman with a temper and a tongue, and no money was to compound the folly in the eyes of every sensible relation he had. And yet the very thing that made the match imprudent made it, in the end, unbreakable. For what bound John and she was not the cool mutual interest that held so many grand marriages together, until the moment interest pulled them apart, but a real and tested attachment that had been forced to fight for itself from the start. She came to the marriage not as an ornament or a bargaining chip, but as an equal, a full partner in the family enterprise. John treated her so all his life, confiding in her, trusting her judgment, leaning on her strength. That partnership of equals, rare in any age and rarer still in theirs, was the quiet foundation beneath all the noise of Sarah's public life, the one relationship she never had to manage because it had never been anything but true. And against all of that stood only one thing, which was that he had fallen completely and permanently in love with a penniless maid of honour who answered him back. The courtship was stormy, and we know a surprising amount about it, because some of the letters survived, and they are unlike almost anything else from that polished, guarded court. John's letters to Sarah are the letters of a man undone, pleading, adoring, wretched when she is cold to him, transported when she is kind. Hers, by contrast, are wary, sharp, demanding, full of suspicion that he is trifling with her, or that his family will win, and he will throw her over for the heiress. She made him work. She doubted him out loud. She accused him of inconstancy and warned him that she would not be made a fool of, and the more she held him at arm's length, the more completely he was hers. It is the same pattern we saw with the lonely little princess, the same quality in Sarah that drew people who could have anyone towards the one person who would not simply fall at their feet. She did not flatter John Churchill any more than she flattered anyone else, and it bound him to her for 40 years. It is worth knowing a little more of the man, because the marriage was the steadiest fact of Sarah's whole turbulent life, and the one relationship she never spoiled. John Churchill had risen by his own merits from very little. His family's loyalty to the crown in the civil wars had cost them their fortune, and he had come to court as a boy, with nothing to recommend him but his person and his manners, and had made his way by soldiering, by courage, under fire abroad, and by a charm so complete that men and women alike found it almost impossible to dislike him. He was the perfect opposite of his future wife in temper. Where she was hot, he was cool. Where she quarrelled, he soothed. Where she made enemies, he made friends and kept them. And the two of them together formed a partnership in which her fierceness and his patience answered one another almost exactly. Their courtship was no smooth road to a sensible match, but a real and difficult love affair, fought out against the steady pressure of his family for him to marry money. We can still feel, in the letters that survive, how completely the cool young officer was overthrown by the one woman who would not simply yield to him, and how she, for all her doubts and her sharp suspicion, was as deeply caught as he was. They married for love against their own interest, which in that calculating world was an extraordinary thing to do, and the gamble paid them back many times over, for they rose together, suffered together, and held to one another through 40 years of triumph and disaster. Whatever Sarah lost in her life, and she lost a queen, several of her children, and most of her friends, she never lost him, and his unbroken devotion is the warm centre around which the rest of her hard and brilliant story turns. In the end, love won over arithmetic, which in that age and that place was almost a scandal in itself. Sometime in the winter of 1677 and 1678, John Churchill and Sarah Jennings were quietly married. No record was kept of the exact day, which tells its own story, because the marriage was a secret one. It had to be. If it became known that Sarah had married, she would lose her place as a maid of honour, and the place was, for the moment, her only standing in the world, and her only means of staying near the centre of things. And so for a time the young couple kept their union hidden, meeting as they could, with only a few trusted people in the secret, among them, importantly, the Duchess of York herself, Mary of Modena, who knew and gave her protection to the match. A married woman passing as a single one, a rising soldier tied for love to a portionless girl, the whole thing carried on in whispers behind the doors of a royal household. It was a thoroughly characteristic beginning for two people who would spend their lives managing secrets and access and the careful placing of the right word in the right ear. The years of the secret marriage were also years of great danger for the whole household to which the young couple had attached themselves, for they were the years of the popish plot and the long crisis over whether the Catholic Duke of York should be allowed to inherit his brother's throne. A wave of anti-Catholic panic swept the country. Men were put to death on the word of perjurers, and Parliament fought again and again to bar the Duke from the succession, so that the very family in whose service the Churchills had placed their hopes stood for a time on the edge of ruin. To have tied one's fortunes to the Catholic heir in that time was to have made a perilous wager, and the Churchills, Protestants both, had to walk a careful line, loyal to the master who advanced them yet alert to the fury of the country against his faith. It was in navigating exactly this kind of danger that the two of them served their long apprenticeship in the art that would define their lives, the art of survival at a court where the ground was always shifting. They learned to keep their own counsel, to read which way the wind was setting, to be useful to the powerful without being destroyed when the powerful fell. The Princess Anne, around whom their hopes increasingly gathered, was the Duke's Protestant daughter, and in her, safely Protestant yet royally placed, the Churchills saw the figure who might carry them through whatever came. Their growing devotion to Anne was thus both heartfelt and shrewd, and the two motives were so tangled together that not even Sarah, probably, could have told you where the love ended and the calculation began. Then, as so often happens, fortune shifted the ground beneath them. In 1677, Sarah's only brother, Ralph, died young. With him gone, she and her sisters became the heirs to the Jennings estates in Hertfordshire and Kent. The portionless girl was suddenly not quite so portionless after all. She brought to the marriage, in the end, a respectable inheritance of land and income, and that inheritance did a good deal to soften the Churchill family's resistance to a union they had thought beneath their ambitious son. What had been an imprudent love match began to look, in the cold light of the property lawyers, rather more sensible. The marriage could come out of the shadows. And it did, at last, in the autumn of 1678, when Sarah's condition made concealment impossible, for she was expecting their first child. The secret was acknowledged, the world was told, and Sarah Jennings became, openly and for the rest of her life, Sarah Churchill. The early married years were lived in the cracks of other people's households, for a soldier and a maid of honour had no establishment of their own and made their home wherever their duties placed them. John was often away, at sea or on the king's service or abroad, on the errands that an ambitious officer could not refuse, and the long separations bred the habit of letters that would become one of the treasures of the age, a private correspondence in which two strong-willed people argued and reconciled, and confided across the miles for decade after decade. Children came quickly, and with them the ordinary terror of that century in which a healthy infant could be carried off in a week, and no amount of love or money could be sure of keeping a child alive. Their first daughter did not live, and the grief of it sits quietly behind the busy ambition of that time, a reminder that even the most fortunate lives of that age were shadowed by the nursery and the small graves. But more children followed who did live, daughters who would grow into great matches and a longed-for son, and the family that Sarah was building gave a shape and a purpose to all her striving. For a woman of her time, the only path to power and security ran through her family, through advantageous marriages for her daughters and a great career for her husband, and she pursued both with the same relentless energy she brought to everything. She was, in this season, attaching herself ever more closely to the household of the Princess Anne, drawn by genuine affection and by a clear sense of where her family's future lay, and the two ambitions, the rise of the husband through the army and the rise of the wife through the friendship, were already braiding together into the single cord that would haul the Churchills to the summit of the kingdom. The early years of the marriage set the pattern of all the years that followed. John's profession was war, and the court and both took him away from her for long stretches, abroad on campaign or on the king's business, and so the two of them learned early to conduct their marriage in large part through letters. Those letters are one of the treasures of the age, because through them we can watch a real marriage across more than 4 decades, and it was by the standards of grand marriages in that world of arranged matches and open infidelities an astonishing thing, a love affair that simply never cooled. He adored her with a constancy that never wavered through everything that came, and she, in her fierce, exacting, difficult way, loved him entirely in return, and trusted him as she trusted no other living soul. Children came, several of them, though as in every family of that time not all would live. There was a first daughter who did not survive infancy, then came Henrietta and Anne, and a longed-for son named John for his father, and Elizabeth and Mary. The Churchills were becoming a family, and they would need a fortune and a future, and the only place to win both was at court, in the service of the great. John would win his at the head of armies. She would win hers in a quieter, and in some ways a more dangerous place, in the private rooms of a princess who had come to love her more than anything else in the world. And it is to that friendship, the heart of the whole story, that we now turn to understand the bond between Sarah Churchill and the Princess Anne. You have to understand first how very lonely Anne was. She had lost her mother as a small child. Her father, the Duke of York, was a remote and rigid man who turned to the Roman Catholic faith, and so set himself at odds with almost the whole of Protestant England. Her elder sister Mary, the bright and favoured one, had been married away to a Dutch prince, and lived across the sea. Anne herself was sickly from girlhood, troubled with the eye complaint that half-blinded her, and with the recurring illnesses that would plague her whole life, and she was by nature timid, stubborn, and slow to give her trust. But once she gave it without reserve. She did not want a glittering circle of friends. She wanted one person, utterly her own, who would love her for herself and not for her rank, and into that aching, particular need walked Sarah Churchill, who happened to be everything Anne was not bold, where Anne was fearful, quick where Anne was slow, certain where Anne wavered. Anne fell in love with her friend in the deep, dependent, all-consuming way that lonely people sometimes do, and for a long time it was the great happiness of her life. What made the friendship possible, in the rigid world of a royal court, was a private fiction the two women invented to hold the difference in their ranks at bay. Between themselves, in their letters and in private, they agreed to set aside who was princess and who was servant, and to be simply two friends, equals, on level ground. Anne chose to be called Mrs. Morley, and she was to be Mrs. Freeman, the name picked, it was said, because it suited Sarah's free and outspoken nature, and so the heir to the throne of England signed herself, in hundreds of letters, as Mrs. Morley, and wrote to her dear Mrs. Freeman with a warmth and a need that are almost painful to overhear across the centuries. She begged for Sarah's company. She fretted when Sarah was away. She poured out her affection in terms so ardent that later, much later, when the friendship had turned to ashes, those very letters would become weapons. But in these early years there was nothing in them but love, the devotion of a shy, plain, unhappy young woman for the one person who made her feel that she was seen. The letters between the two women, which Sarah kept all her life and produced in the end as evidence, let us hear the friendship in its own voice, and the voice is startling. Anne wrote to her dear Mrs. Freeman, not as a princess to a servant, but as a lover almost begging for her company, wretched at her absences, declaring that she would rather live in a cottage with her friend than reign in a palace without her. Modern readers sometimes wonder at the heat of such language, but it was the language of intense female friendship in that age, and whatever else it was real, the overflowing of a starved heart that had found at last someone to fasten upon. For a princess who had been given little tenderness in her life, who had lost her mother early and stood always in the shadow of a brighter sister, the discovery of a friend who seemed to love her for herself was the great event of her existence, and she clung to it with the whole force of a loyal and lonely nature. Sarah's side of the friendship was warmer than her enemies allowed and cooler than Anne's, which is to say that it was the affection of a strong nature for a weaker one, fond, protective, a little impatient, and entirely confident of its own power. He managed Anne as one manages a beloved but exasperating relation, advising her, correcting her, steering her, and taking her devotion rather for granted, as people take for granted the love they have never had to work for. This was the seed of the eventual ruin, though no one could have seen it then. A friendship between equals can survive plain speaking, but a friendship in which one party is destined to become the Queen of England cannot forever bear to be managed, and the very confidence that made Sarah so commanding a friend in the years of waiting would make her an intolerable one, once her friend was wearing a crown. For now, though, there was only the warmth, and the two of them moved through the uncertain years bound together against the world. For Sarah, we should be clear-eyed. The friendship was both genuine and useful, and she would have seen no contradiction between the two, because no one at that court ever did. She was fond of Anne, in her brisk and managing way. She also understood from the first exactly what such a friendship was worth. To be the chosen favourite of the person who stood next in line, after Mary, to the throne of England was to hold something beyond price. A private channel straight to power that no office could buy and no rival could easily seize. She did not have to scheme for it. And pressed it upon her, again and again, the love, the trust, the places, the gifts, the promises that whatever Anne one day became, she would rise with her. And Sarah took what was offered, as anyone in that world would have taken it, and bound her own family's prospects ever more tightly to the fortunes of her royal friend. The two threads of her life, the husband climbing through the army and the princess climbing towards a crown, were being twisted together into a single rope, and for 30 years it would haul the Churchills steadily upward. The friendship was, among everything else, the foundation of the family's wealth, and it would be false to the hard realities of that world to pretend otherwise. Anne was generous to those she loved, and she pressed upon her dear friend not only her affection, but the solid currency of court life, places and pensions, and the steady advancement of the whole Churchill connection. When Anne had money to give, Sarah's household felt the benefit of it. When there were posts to be filled in the princess's household, the Churchills and their friends filled them, and the rising star of the husband on the battlefield was matched, step for step, by the rising fortune of the wife in the closet. In an age when a family made its way by attaching itself to a great patron, the Churchills had attached themselves to the best patron imaginable, the heir to the throne who loved one of them, as she loved no one else alive. None of this means the affection was false, For in that world genuine love and material advantage were not opposites, but partners, and a friendship could be both the truest thing in two lives and the engine of a great career at once. She cherished Anne and drew on the bond, and saw nothing strange in doing both, because everyone she knew did the same with every relationship they had. What was unusual was not that she profited from the friendship, but the sheer scale of what the friendship became. A private bond between two women that grew into one of the great political facts of the age, so that the moods and quarrels of two friends could shake ministries and shape the course of a war. It was a strange kind of power, unofficial, unacknowledged, resting on nothing but love, and it was, while it lasted, very nearly without limit. There was a directness in the way Sarah handled Anne that no one else at court would have dared, and which was, paradoxically, the very thing Anne loved her for. Everyone else flattered the princess. She told her the truth, or what Sarah took to be the truth, plainly and often sharply. She argued with her. She corrected her. She treated her, in private, not as a sacred royal person, but as a friend who could be scolded and teased and disagreed with. To a young woman drowning in the empty politeness of a court, this bracing honesty was like cold water on a hot day, and Anne drank it gratefully. It was only much later, when Anne was no longer a neglected princess but the Queen of England, that the same plain speaking would begin to feel less like honesty and more like domination, and the gift would curdle into a grievance. But that turning was years away, and in this season the bond was at its sweetest. The favourite spoke her mind, and the princess adored her for it, and neither of them could imagine a day when it would be otherwise. Sharper eyes at court had already begun to wonder where such a friendship could possibly lead. To watch a princess so entirely governed by a subject, to see the heir to the throne defer in everything to a woman of no particular rank, was to glimpse a power that had no name and no settled place in the constitution of things, and shrewd observers understood that a power resting on nothing but personal love was as fragile as it was great. Favour given without office could be taken away without ceremony. A heart that had fastened so completely on one person might, if it ever loosened, swing as completely to another, and a friendship that depended on the constant presence and pleasure of a future queen was a dangerous thing to build a family's whole fortune upon. But these were the calculations of cool heads, and neither of the two women concerned was thinking in such terms. For Anne, the friendship was simply the warmth at the centre of a cold life, and she could no more imagine losing it than imagine losing the use of her own hands. For Sarah, it was both the great affection of her younger years and the obvious foundation of her family's rise, and she trusted in it with the absolute confidence of a person who has never yet been failed by the thing she relies upon. That confidence was her strength and would prove her undoing, for it made her careless, sure that a love so deep could survive any amount of plain speaking and any number of absences, and so she spent it freely, never dreaming that even the deepest well might one day run dry. The friendship deepened and was formalized when Anne herself married. In the summer of 1683, the Princess Anne was given in marriage to Prince George of Denmark, a stolid, kindly, unambitious man, fond of his food and his drink and his wife, who would prove a faithful and affectionate husband, and who asked nothing of the world but to be left in peace. It was a happy enough match in its quiet way, and crucially it gave Anne her own household, her own establishment of servants and ladies and officers, separate from her father's, and answerable to herself. And first thing Anne did with that household was to bring Sarah Churchill into the very heart of it. She was made one of the ladies of Anne's bedchamber, which meant that she was now, by office as well as by affection, among the closest of the princess's attendants, with the right to be near her at all hours in the most private rooms, with a daily, hourly intimacy that few people ever have with the great. The marriage to Prince George gave Anne not only a household, but a settled and contented domestic life. For George was an easy, affectionate, unambitious man who loved his wife, asked nothing of politics, and was happy to leave the management of everything to others. He is the most overlooked figure in the whole story, a kind and faithful husband through some 25 years and 17 heartbreaking pregnancies, and his very mildness left a space at the centre of Anne's life that Sarah filled completely. The two women now had their own establishment, lodgings at the Cockpit near Whitehall and later their own court, and within it Sarah's word was very nearly law, for she controlled the appointments, the access and the daily ordering of the princess's world. It is in this season that we can see most clearly what the office of favourite really meant, for it was not a thing written in any list of court places, but a power that grew in the gaps between the official roles. She was a lady of the bedchamber, and later much more, but her true position was simply that she was the person Anne loved and trusted above all others, and in a system where everything depended on the will of the sovereign, to govern the heart of the heir to the throne was to hold a power that no minister could match. Ambitious men were already beginning to understand this, to court Sarah's good opinion, to route their requests through her, to treat the Churchills as a rising power in the land. The friendship that had begun in the loneliness of two young women was quietly becoming one of the central facts of English politics, and it would remain so for a quarter of a century, until the day it broke. That is the position from which everything else would grow, so it is worth understanding what it really meant. The bedchamber in a royal household was not merely where one slept. It was the inner sanctum, the place where the public mask came off, where the great person was dressed and undressed, where private words were spoken, and private decisions half-formed before they were ever announced to the world. To control access to the bedchamber, to be one of the few permitted inside it, was to control the most precious commodity in the whole machinery of power, which was nearness to the source. Sarah Churchill now held that nearness with the heir to the throne, and held it not as a cold office but warmed through and through by genuine love. She could speak to Anne when ministers could not. She could carry a word in or keep a word out. She could shape, by 100 small daily touches, the thoughts and the moods and the loyalties of the woman who might at any time become queen. These were the years in the middle of the 1680s when the whole question of the succession came to its crisis. For in 1685 the old king died, and the Catholic Duke of York came to the throne at last, as James II. Within months the new king faced a rebellion led by his nephew, and it was John Churchill who played a decisive part in crushing it, commanding the royal troops with cool skill at the battle that ended the rising, and confirmed his reputation as a soldier of the first rank. For a moment the Churchills stood high in the favour of the new Catholic king, rewarded for their service, seemingly secure. But the security was an illusion, for James set about his disastrous campaign to advance his religion, and every month that passed drove a deeper wedge between the king and the nation, and between the king and his own Protestant daughter. Anne, watching her father's course with growing alarm, drew ever closer to the one person she trusted entirely, and Sarah, staunch for the reformed religion, did nothing to ease the princess's fears, and a good deal, we may suspect, to sharpen them. The household at the Cockpit became a refuge of Protestant feeling within a court turning Catholic, and the bond between the two women took on, in these tense years, a political weight it had not had before. When the final crisis came, as it surely would, Anne would have to choose between her father and her faith, between the king who had given her life and the Protestant cause that her friend embodied, and there was little real doubt, given who held her heart, which way that choice would fall. The flight into the night was already, in this season, being silently prepared. She was, though no one yet used such words, becoming a power in the land. And then, while she was still learning the full reach of that power, the whole kingdom turned over beneath all their feet, and a king lost his throne in a single bloodless season, and she and Anne found themselves, on one dark night, fleeing together down a back staircase into the dark. The crisis had been building for years. In 1685, Charles II had died, and Anne's father had come to the throne at last as James II. The trouble was his religion. James was an open and devout Roman Catholic, in a country that had spent a century learning to fear Catholic kings, and he set about, with a stubbornness that bordered on recklessness, trying to win toleration and place for his fellow Catholics, packing offices, pressing the bishops, raising a standing army with Catholic officers, until the leading men of the nation grew first uneasy and then frightened. For a while they endured it, telling themselves that the king was old, that his heirs were his two staunchly Protestant daughters, Mary and Anne, and that when he died, the country would right itself. And then, in the summer of 1688, the king's young Catholic wife, Mary of Modena, gave birth to a son, a Catholic prince, a male heir who would take precedence over both his Protestant half-sisters, promised not a passing trouble, but a whole Catholic dynasty stretching into the future. That birth was the spark that lit the train. The summer of the crisis had been building toward an explosion for months. The king had pressed his policies past what the nation would bear, putting Catholics into offices and the army and the universities, and when 7 of the bishops of his own church refused to lend themselves to his designs, he had them put on trial, only to see them acquitted amid wild public rejoicing that showed how completely he had lost his people. Into this furnace came the birth of the king's son, and with it the rumour, eagerly believed because it was so badly needed, that the child was no true prince at all, but an impostor smuggled into the bed in a warming pan to cheat the Protestant heirs of their inheritance. The slander was almost certainly false, but its very wildness measured the desperation of a nation that could not stomach a Catholic dynasty, and it gave the leading men the excuse they wanted to act. The invitation went out across the sea, and in the autumn William of Orange landed in the west with his army, and began his slow advance, and the kingdom held its breath to see who would fight for the king. Almost no one did. The desertions began among the great and spread through the ranks, and when John Churchill rode out of the royal camp to join the invader, he carried with him not only his own sword, but a signal to many waverers that the cause was lost. It was the supreme gamble of his life, for to desert one's anointed king was treason if the gamble failed, and the man who had owed everything to the house of Stuart now staked everything on its fall. The gamble succeeded beyond any hope, the king's nerve broke, and the throne that had seemed so solid in the spring stood empty by the new year, with the Churchills among the great winners of the whole astonishing turn. What followed has been called, by the side that won, the Glorious Revolution. The leading men of England sent in secret across the sea to Mary's husband, William of Orange, the Dutch prince who was both James's nephew and his son-in-law, and invited him to come over with an army and set things right. He came, landing in the west of England in November of 1688, with a strong force, and as he advanced towards London, the astonishing thing was how few would fight for the king. James's support melted like snow. Officer after officer, lord after lord, slipped away from him and went over to William, and among the most important of those who deserted the king was John Churchill. He had risen high in James's service, owed his career to the York family, and now, judging that the king's cause was lost and the country's mind made up, he abandoned his royal master and went over to William of Orange. It was, depending on who tells it, either a clear-eyed act of patriotism or a cold act of betrayal, and very probably it was both at once, for that was the kind of choice the age forced on ambitious men, and John Churchill was nothing if not a man who read the times. And while John was deserting the father, she was at the side of the daughter, managing a desertion of her own. The Princess Anne was in an agony of divided feeling, torn between loyalty to her father the king, and loyalty to her religion and her sister's husband, and into that frightened confusion Sarah Churchill stepped with characteristic decision. There was little doubt that Sarah, firmly Protestant and firmly tied to the rising side, helped steady Anne's nerve and guide her towards the choice that the Churchills' interests required. When the news came that John had gone over to William, James's anger turned towards his own daughter, and Anne feared with reason that she would be seized and held as a hostage for her husband's and her friend's good behaviour. So a flight was arranged in secret by night. Down a back staircase of the palace at Whitehall, in the dark, the Princess Anne crept away from her father's house, with Sarah Churchill at her side and a small party of trusted companions, and was carried off to safety in the north of the city, and then away beyond the king's reach. A princess fleeing her own father into the night, with her favourite holding her hand, is an image that fixes the whole nature of the bond. In the great crisis when thrones were falling, it was not to a statesman or a husband that Anne turned, but to Mrs. Freeman. The drama of that flight is worth dwelling on, for it shows how high the stakes had risen and how completely Anne depended on her friend in the moment of greatest danger. When the news came that her husband and her brother-in-law had deserted to William, the king's anger turned upon his younger daughter, and Anne, terrified that she would be confined, resolved to run. It was Sarah, with a few trusted men, who arranged the escape, leading the frightened princess down a back stair by night, out through a servant's door, into a waiting coach, and away through the dark streets to safety with friends in the city, and then north out of the king's reach. For a heavily built, short-sighted, frightened young woman to flee her own father's palace in the night was no small thing, and that she did it with Sarah at her side, trusting her friend's nerve where her own failed, tells the whole story of who held the centre of her life. The revolution that followed remade the kingdom and the Churchills with it. James, abandoned by almost everyone, lost his nerve and fled to France, and the throne passed to his Protestant daughter Mary and her Dutch husband, who reigned together with her as joint sovereigns. The men who had helped to bring this about were rewarded, and John Churchill, who had judged the moment and changed sides at exactly the right time, was raised to the earldom of Marlborough, with his wife a countess beside him. They had wagered everything on reading the times correctly, and they had won, rising at a single stroke into the front rank of the new order. But the very triumph carried a poison in it, for the new king was a cold and watchful man who never quite trusted the clever general who had betrayed one master and might betray another, and the suspicion that the king conceived in this season would, before long, bring the Marlboroughs crashing down into the worst disgrace of their lives. The revolution succeeded with hardly a shot. James, broken in nerve and abandoned by his people, fled to France, and the throne was declared vacant. In the settlement that followed, William and his wife Mary, Anne's elder sister, were made joint sovereigns, King William III and Queen Mary II, ruling together. Anne, for her part, gave up her own place in the line for the moment, agreeing that William should reign for his life even should Mary die before him, in return for a handsome income and recognition of her rights thereafter. The Churchills had backed the winning side and backed it early, and the rewards came as rewards come to such men. John Churchill was raised to the peerage as Earl of Marlborough, and she became a Countess of Marlborough, a long step up the ladder from the maid of honour of a few years before. They had wagered their loyalty on the turning of the times and won. and they stood now among the great families of the new reign, close to a princess, who was now second in line to the crown. The settlement that followed the revolution did more than change the persons on the throne, it changed the throne itself. The new sovereigns reigned by the gift of Parliament, and on conditions Parliament laid down, the old claims of kings to rule by divine and unanswerable right were quietly buried, and a great declaration of rights fixed the liberties of the subject and the limits of the crown in a way that no later king could easily undo. England had become, in the space of a single bloodless winter, a different kind of monarchy, one in which the will of Parliament and the rights of Protestants were written into the foundations of the state, and the family that had helped to bring this about rose with the new order it had helped to make. For the Churchills, the meaning of it all was both grand and intensely personal. They had backed the winning side at exactly the right moment and been rewarded with a great title and a place among the leaders of the new reign. But more than that, they had tied their fortunes to a settlement that put their Protestant princess in the direct line to the crown and made her eventual accession the near certain hope of the future. Everything now pointed forward to the day when Anne would reign, and the Churchills, as the closest friends and servants of that princess, could look on that distant day as the sure foundation of all their hopes. They had only to keep her friendship, keep her safe, and wait. And the waiting, though it would prove long and full of reverses, would in the end deliver them everything they had wagered upon. But the very success of the revolution sowed the seeds of a bitter quarrel, and it is a quarrel that tells us a good deal about the kind of hold Sarah Churchill now had over Anne. For all that William and Mary were on the throne, the new king and his sister-in-law Anne did not love one another, and the two royal sisters, Mary and Anne, who had once been close, fell into a coldness that hardened into open estrangement. And at the very centre of that estrangement, accused by the Queen of being its cause, stood Sarah, Countess of Marlborough. The trouble was partly money and partly pride, and underneath both it was the old, simple matter of who controlled Anne's heart. Queen Mary believed, and she was not wholly wrong, that Sarah Churchill had acquired an unhealthy dominion over her younger sister, that Anne would do nothing and think nothing without first consulting her favourite, and the influence of the ambitious Marlboroughs over the heir to the throne was a danger to the crown itself. Mary pressed Anne, as a sister and as a queen, to dismiss her favourite from her service, and Anne refused. She refused flatly, repeatedly, and with a stubbornness that astonished everyone who thought of her as a weak and yielding woman, for on this one subject Anne was immovable as rock. She would sooner quarrel with her sister the Queen, sooner give up her lodgings at court, sooner endure any pressure that could be brought, than part with her dear Mrs. Freeman. Here, early and unmistakable, was the measure of Sarah's power. The Queen of England commanded, and the heir to the throne defied her, and chose her friend over her own sister and sovereign. It was a devotion almost without limit, and Sarah, one suspects, took it as no more than her due. There was, in this season under William and Mary, something very like a rival court gathered around the Princess Anne, and the Marlboroughs were at the heart of it, which did nothing to ease the suspicions of the king. Anne, slighted and unhappy, drew about her a circle of those who were out of favour with the king, and her lodgings became a gathering point for discontent, a place where the disappointed and the ambitious could pay their respects to the heir to the crown while keeping a careful distance from the reigning king they disliked. To William, watchful and insecure on a throne he held by invitation rather than by blood, this shadow court was a standing danger, and Sarah, as the woman who ruled it, became in his eyes a figure of real political menace, not merely a quarrelsome favourite, but the manager of a faction. That is part of why the blow, when it fell so hard. The The charges against Marlborough were never fully proved, and the forged paper that helped to send him to the Tower was exposed for what it was, but the episode revealed how exposed the family had become, how quickly the Heights could turn to a prison, how little their services counted against the distrust of a king. For the Duchess it was a bitter schooling in the precariousness of all court fortune, a lesson that nothing was secure, that favour could vanish overnight, that the only sure defences were money in hand and a friend on the throne. She came out of the disgrace more fiercely devoted than ever to the two things that could protect her family, the building of a great private fortune and the binding of Anne ever more closely to herself, and both of those devotions would shape, for good and for ill, everything that came after. The quarrel between the sisters grew worse, and then it grew dangerous, because in the early 1690s the Marlboroughs fell suddenly and hard from the king's favour. John, Earl of Marlborough, for all his services in bringing William to power, was a man whom the king never quite trusted, and with reason, for Marlborough was already, like many cautious men of that uncertain age, keeping a quiet line open to the exiled court of James II across the Channel, in case the wheel should turn again. It was a kind of insurance that a great many people took out in that time, hedging against a Stuart restoration, but it was also, strictly, treason. And when William grew suspicious of his over-clever general, the fall was swift. In 1692, Marlborough was abruptly stripped of all his offices and dismissed from court in disgrace. Worse followed. He was accused of conspiring with the exiled king, arrested and committed to the Tower of London, that grim fortress on the river where the kingdom kept its prisoners of state, and from which not everyone came out alive. The charge against him rested in part on forged papers and came to nothing in the end, and he was released after some weeks, but the message was plain. The Marlboroughs were out, under a cloud, suspected, and far from the warmth of royal favour. The suspicion that destroyed them for a time was not wholly without foundation, for these were years when almost every prudent man at the top of affairs kept some secret line open to the exiled king across the water, in case the wheel of fortune should turn yet again, and Marlborough was as prudent as any. Exactly how far his secret dealings went has been argued over ever since, and one dark accusation, that he betrayed a coming English attack on the French coast to the enemy, has never been either firmly proved or wholly cleared away, and it is fairer to the man to leave it hanging in the doubt where the evidence leaves it than to settle it either way. What is certain is that William never trusted him, that the king had reason for his distrust, and that the distrust was enough, in the dangerous climate of the time, to bring the family crashing down. The disgrace did not last forever, for two things rescued the Marlboroughs from the cold. The first was the death of Queen Mary at the very end of 1694, which removed the bitterest enemy of the family and made a patched-up peace between William and Anne both necessary and possible. The second was simply that Marlborough was too able a man to waste, and a king fighting a long and difficult war could not forever leave his finest soldier unemployed out of mere suspicion. Slowly the ban eased, the family crept back toward favour, and by the closing years of the reign, Marlborough was not only restored, but entrusted with the highest responsibilities, even the care and education of the little Duke of Gloucester, the heir on whom the whole future depended. The lesson of the disgrace, never forgotten, was that favour was a treacherous foundation, and that the only sure ground was money, blood, and a friend upon the throne. This was the lowest point of their fortunes, and it is the point at which Anne's loyalty shone most fiercely, when the Queen, furious at the disgrace of the Marlboroughs, renewed her demand that Anne dismiss her favourite from her household. Anne again refused, and this time the refusal cost her dearly. She was in effect driven from court, made to give up her lodgings, deprived of the guards and honours due to her rank, left isolated and slighted by her sister the Queen. and through all of it she would not give up her friend. She offered, or said she offered, to withdraw herself rather than be the cause of such trouble to the princess she loved. Anne would not hear of it. She wrote to her dear Mrs. Freeman in terms of passionate devotion, swearing that she would never, whatever was done to her, part with her, that she would live in a cottage rather than abandon her friend, that they would face the world's coldness together. The two women drew closer in adversity than they had ever been in prosperity, and Sarah, sharing the princess's exile from favour, became more than ever the indispensable companion of Anne's heart. It was in its way the purest season of the friendship, the season when there was nothing to be gained from it, only loss to be shared, and they shared it. Then, in the last days of 1694, the whole situation shifted again, as it always did with a death. Queen Mary, still young, caught the smallpox, that great killer of the age, and died of it within days, leaving William to reign on alone. With Mary gone, the chief author of the quarrel was removed, and a reconciliation, of a cool and formal kind, became possible. William, who had no children and now no wife, needed Anne, for she was once again the undoubted heir to his throne, and the hope of the Protestant succession. A grudging peace was patched up. Anne was restored to her honours and her lodgings. The harsh treatment ended, and in time, though William never warmed to Marlborough, the ban on the disgraced Earl began to ease, and he was gradually allowed back towards the edges of public life, his abilities too useful to a king at war to be wasted forever in the cold. The Marlboroughs had weathered the worst, and they had weathered it because Anne had stood by them with a constancy that nothing could shake, and because they had read, correctly, that her day was surely coming. The years that followed, the closing years of the old century, were years of waiting, and they were marked above all by a long and terrible private grief that bound Sarah and Anne together in a different way. For all the public talk of the Protestant succession resting safely upon Anne, the truth of Anne's life was one of almost unimaginable sorrow in the bearing of children. Again and again, across nearly 2 decades, the princess conceived. Again and again, the pregnancies ended in loss, in children stillborn, in infants who lived a few hours or a few days or a few weeks and then died, in miscarriage after miscarriage that wore down her health and broke her heart by degrees. The exact count is uncertain and scarcely bears dwelling on, but it ran to something like 17 pregnancies, and out of all of them, only one child lived past infancy into boyhood. That child was William, Duke of Gloucester, born in 1689, a bright, brave, sickly little boy on whom the hopes of a whole dynasty came to rest, the one living proof that the Protestant line might continue through Anne's own body. The turn of the century brought the deaths that cleared Anne's path to the throne and set the stage for the great war that would define her reign. The little Duke of Gloucester died in the summer of 1700, extinguishing the hope of a direct Protestant heir and forcing Parliament to settle the succession upon the distant House of Hanover. The following year the exiled King James died in France, and the French king, in a gesture of breathtaking provocation, recognised his son as the rightful King of England, an insult that united the English nation in anger, and made the coming war with France a matter of national honour as well as of policy. The pieces were falling into place for the reign that would carry the Marlboroughs to their zenith, an age of war against the overweening power of France, with Anne on the throne and Marlborough at the head of her armies. Undurable the halt. When King William, worn out and ailing, was thrown from his horse and died in the early spring of 1702, the way was at last clear. He had, in his final months, come to rely on Marlborough as the one man who could lead the coming struggle, and so the very king who had once sent the Duke to the Tower handed him, at the end, the command of the nation's armies, and the management of its great alliance. It was a remarkable turn, the disgraced traitor of one reign becoming the indispensable hero of the next, and it placed the Marlboroughs, as Anne came to her throne, in a position of power such as no English family had held in living memory. Everything that Sarah had waited for and worked for through the long stretches of patience now lay open before her, and she stepped into it with the absolute confidence of a woman who had never doubted that this day would come. Through all that time of hope and loss, she was at Anne's side, and we should give the friendship its due here, for this was not a season of profit. There was nothing to be gained at a childbed but the sharing of pain, and she shared it. She attended the princess through pregnancy after pregnancy, and grief after grief, and whatever else may be said of her, and a good deal would later be said, she did not abandon her friend in those long years of sorrow. The little Duke of Gloucester grew into a delicate, soldier-mad boy who drilled small companies of servants' children in the park and longed to be a man and a warrior. And then in the summer of 1700, just days after his 11th birthday, the boy fell ill of a fever, and within a few days he was dead. The death of the little Duke of Gloucester was a catastrophe far beyond the household grief of a mother, terrible as that was. It meant that Anne, now plainly never to raise an heir of her own body, was the last Protestant Stuart, and that, after her, the crown must pass to strangers, to the distant German relations of the royal house, the Electress Sophia of Hanover and her son. The great Act of Parliament, the Act of Settlement, was passed the next year to fix that succession in law and keep the throne forever out of Catholic hands. But for Anne, the loss was simply the death of her last child, the end of all her hopes as a mother, and once again it was to Sarah that she turned in her desolation. The scale of Anne's suffering as a mother is difficult to take in, and it is the great sorrow that runs beneath the whole of her reign. Across some 17 or 18 pregnancies, she endured stillbirths, miscarriages, and the deaths of infants and small children, one after another, a procession of loss that would have broken most people entirely, and that left her, by the end, a worn and grieving woman long before her time, lamed by gout and swollen by ill health, who had given everything her body had to give, and had almost nothing living to show for it. To stand beside a friend through that much grief on and on was a real service, and whatever Sarah's faults, she did not fail Anne in those rooms of sorrow, and the bond forged there was not a thing of mere ambition. What such relentless loss did to Anne, and to the friendship at the centre of her life, can hardly be overstated. Each new grief drove her further into herself, and further into her dependence on the one person who had never failed her, so that by the time the crown came within her reach, she was a woman with almost nothing left to live for but her faith, her sense of duty, and the companion who had shared every sorrow. The clever, ailing, much disappointed princess, who would soon be queen, had learned to expect little of the world and to hold hard to the little she had, and the thing she held hardest was the bond with her dear Mrs. Freeman. It was an attachment built on grief as much as on happiness, tempered through long seasons of shared suffering, and it should, by every law of the heart, have been unbreakable. That it broke all the same, and broke past mending, is the quiet tragedy beneath both their lives, and it lay still unsuspected, only a little way ahead. The old century turned into the new. In 1702, King William, never robust, was thrown from his horse when the animal stumbled on a molehill, broke his collarbone, and, weakened, took a chill, and died. And so at last, after all the waiting, after the long exile from favour, the disgrace, the deaths, the patient years, the moment the Marlboroughs had staked their lives upon, arrived. On the 8th of March in the year 1702, the Princess Anne became Anne, Queen of England, Scotland, and Ireland, the last sovereign of the House of Stuart, the plump, short-sighted, much-grieved woman who had crept down a back staircase into the night, who had been bullied and slighted, and who had clung through it all to one beloved friend, was now the anointed queen of a great kingdom at the dawn of a new age of war. And the friend who had held her hand through all of it, the dazzling, fearless girl from the house by the water, who had answered a princess back and bound her heart forever, stood now at the very summit of the world, the closest confidant of the Queen of England, with the keys of the bedchamber and the privy purse in her hands, and a husband about to become the greatest soldier in Europe. Everything Sarah Churchill had worked for and waited for had come to pass. What she could not yet see, in the bright morning of that triumph, was that the very height she had reached was the most dangerous place she had ever stood. There is a long and melancholy pattern in the history of courts, and Sarah, for all her cleverness, seems never to have seen that she was walking straight into it. Again and again, across the centuries, a sovereign raises up a favourite, a single beloved companion, who rises higher than birth or office could ever carry them, who gathers to themselves the access and the influence that everyone else must scramble for, and who seems, for a season, to be unassailable. And again the same favourites fall, undone by the envy they provoke, by the enemies their monopoly creates, and above all, by the simple truth that a power resting on one person's affection lasts exactly as long as that affection, and not a day longer. To rise as a favourite is to climb a tower with no stair down. Sarah had reached the very top of that tower. She held more of the Queen's favour than any favourite of that age, and she held it not by cold service, but by a love of 30 years' standing, which must have seemed to her the surest foundation in the world. But the higher the favour, the harder the fall, and the very completeness of her dominion ensured that the whole disappointed ambition of a great court was gathered below her, waiting for the smallest sign of a crack. She had enemies she did not trouble to count, and rivals she did not deign to notice. And she had, in her own ungovernable temper, the one weapon that could bring her down where all their plotting might have failed. The most dangerous place in any kingdom is the place nearest the throne, and she stood closer to it than anyone, and never once looked down. The new queen lost no time in raising her beloved friend to a position without parallel. Within days of her accession, Anne heaped upon Sarah a cluster of the greatest offices a woman could hold at court, offices that together made her the most powerful female subject in the kingdom. She was made groom of the stole, the head of the Queen's bedchamber, and the most intimate of all the royal household posts. She was made mistress of the robes, with charge of the Queen's wardrobe and appearance. She was made keeper of the privy purse, which put into her own hands the management of the sovereign's private money, a vast sum spent at her discretion. And she was made ranger of Windsor Great Park, which came with a fine lodge and a handsome income, and a place in the country near the Queen. The salaries and perquisites of these offices alone made her rich, but the salaries were the least of it. What these posts truly conferred was total, daily, unrivalled access to the person of the Queen of England, the very thing that all the ambition of the court most desired and could not buy, now gathered into the hands of one woman who already held the Queen's whole heart. The government that took shape at Anne's accession rested on a partnership of 3, and for a few years it worked superbly. Marlborough led the armies and managed the foreign alliance. His close friend Godolphin, the Lord Treasurer, found the money and steered the business of the kingdom, and she held the Queen, the living link that bound the whole arrangement together. Contemporaries spoke of the two men as the great managers of the reign, and behind them, less visible but no less essential, stood the Duchess, for it was her hold on Anne's affection that gave the partnership its access to the crown. The family connection reached further still, for Sarah's daughters were married into the leading Whig and court houses, weaving the Marlboroughs into the very fabric of the governing class, so that the rise of one family seemed for a time to be the rise of a whole new order. But the strength of the arrangement was also its weakness, for it bound the fortunes of the Marlboroughs entirely to the favour of a single ailing woman, and that favour, as Sarah was slowly making sure, could not last. The Queen wished to govern above party, to be the mother of all her people. The Marlboroughs and Godolphin found that they could not carry on the war without the support of the Whigs, and so they pressed the Queen, season by season, deeper into the arms of a party she distrusted. She pressed hardest of all, with a passion for the Whig cause that knew no restraint and no tact, and every push drove the Queen a little further from her. The very triumphs of the reign, the victories and the alliances, thus rested on a foundation that was quietly crumbling, the foundation of a friendship being worn away by the friend who depended on it most. It is worth dwelling on what that power actually looked like in practice, because it was a kind of power that has almost no modern equal, and that the age itself only half admitted existed. There was no office called Chief Minister, no recognised place for a favourite. And yet everyone at court understood that the road to the Queen's mind ran through Sarah Churchill. Ministers sought her help to reach the Queen. Place seekers begged her to put in a word. Bishops owed their promotion, courtiers their advancement, soldiers their commissions, in part to whether the Countess of Marlborough thought well of them. She could not command, exactly, but she could shape, and the shaping of a sovereign's daily thoughts and moods and small decisions is, over time, very close to ruling. And because Sarah was tied by blood and marriage to her husband and to his great friend the Lord Treasurer, she sat at the centre of a family connection that now in effect ran the government of England. Her husband led the armies. His closest political ally managed the money and the Parliament, and she held the Queen. It was a triangle of power resting on three people who trusted one another completely, and at its apex sat a woman who had begun as a maid of honour with no fortune at all. The coronation itself was a kind of emblem of the woman who now wore the crown, for Anne was already so crippled by gout that she had to be carried to her own crowning in a low chair, a sick and sorrowful woman of 37, lifted to the highest place in the land. And at her right hand, in the fullness of her own power and confidence, stood Sarah, no longer the friend of a powerless princess, but the mistress of the household of the Queen of England, holding more high offices than any lady of the court had ever held at once, and disposing of a private power greater than that of most ministers of state. For a few years the arrangement worked, because the three at the top, the Queen's favourite, the Queen's general, and the Queen's treasurer, were bound together by trust and by family, and pulled in the same direction, and the Queen, still loving and still guided, let them pull. Yet from the very beginning there was a flaw in the design that no amount of victory abroad could mend, and it lay in the difference of conviction between the favourite and the Queen. She was a Whig to the marrow, fierce for the war, fierce for the moneyed men who financed it, fierce against the Tories and the High Church party. Anne was a Tory by every instinct of her heart, devoted to the Church of England above all things, suspicious of the Whigs as enemies of that church, and longing to reign above the parties rather than be captured by one of them. As long as Sarah merely advised, the difference could be managed, but she did not merely advise. She pressed, she argued, she lectured, she tried to bend the Queen by sheer force of will to her own party, and in doing so she slowly transformed herself, in Anne's tired eyes, from the beloved friend who told the truth into the domineering subject who would not let her be a queen. The cooling had begun in the very hour of triumph, but here, at the very summit, The seeds of the eventual ruin were already sprouting, and they grew out of the very qualities that had carried Sarah upward. The first was politics. Sarah Churchill was a passionate and increasingly fierce supporter of one of the two great parties that were then taking shape in English public life, the Whigs, the party more friendly to the war, to the moneyed interest, and to a strict Protestant settlement. Anne, by contrast, was by temperament and conviction a Tory, attached to the Church of England and the old landed order, suspicious of the Whigs, and longing above all to be a queen of all her people, rather than the prisoner of any faction. As the reign went on, she pressed her Whig opinions on the Queen with growing heat, lecturing her, arguing with her, trying to drag her by force of will towards the party she favoured. And the more she pushed, the more the gentle, stubborn Queen resisted, and resented the pushing. The plain speaking that Anne had once loved as a refreshing honesty began to feel like hectoring. The friend who had once soothed her now wearied and even frightened her. Slowly, almost invisibly at first, the warmth between Mrs. Morley and Mrs. Freeman began to cool, and into the small space that opened between them, a quiet third person was about to step. Before we come to that quiet third person, though, we must follow the other arm of the family's power to its dazzling height, across the sea to the battlefields of Europe, where Sarah's husband was about to make the name of Marlborough ring through the whole continent and win for his family the greatest prize an English subject had ever been given. For the reign of Queen Anne was, above everything else, a reign of war. And the war was very largely won by John Churchill, and every victory he gained abroad strengthened, for a time, the hold of his wife at home. The war was the Great War of the Spanish Succession, a vast struggle that drew in most of the powers of Europe to prevent the mighty King of France, Louis XIV, from joining the crowns of France and Spain, and so dominating the whole continent. England, with the Dutch and the Austrians and a host of smaller allies, threw itself into the contest, and at the head of the Allied armies was placed John Churchill, now raised to the rank of Duke of Marlborough. He proved to be one of the supreme commanders in the history of war, a general of such patience, daring, and care for his men that they came to call him the Old Corporal, and he won a series of victories so complete that they astonished a continent. The greatest of them came in the summer of 1704, far up the river Danube in the heart of Germany, near a village called Blenheim. There Marlborough, after a march of breathtaking audacity across the length of Europe, fell upon the French and Bavarian army and broke it utterly, capturing its commander and tens of thousands of men, and turning back the whole tide of the war in a single day. When the fighting was over, he scribbled a few hurried words in pencil on the back of a tavern bill and sent them racing across Europe to England, to be carried to the Queen. And the message was addressed not to a minister, but to his wife. It is a small thing, that hasty note from the greatest battlefield of the age, sent first of all to Sarah, but it tells you again where this man's heart lay through all his glory. Blenheim was the first and most dazzling of Marlborough's victories, but it was far from the last, and the run of triumphs that followed kept the family aloft even as the ground shifted beneath them at home. 2 years after Blenheim came the victory at Ramillies, which swept the French out of much of the Low Countries in a single afternoon. 2 years after that came the hard-fought field of Oudenarde, and the year after that the terrible battle of Malplaquet, the bloodiest day of the whole war, a victory so dearly bought in dead and wounded men that it shook the nation's stomach for the fighting. Year after year the Duke went out in the spring and came home in the autumn, having beaten the greatest power in Europe yet again, and for a time the glory of it seemed to place the Marlboroughs beyond the reach of any rival. But long wars grow unpopular, and the very scale of the victories began by a cruel logic to work against those who won them. The fighting dragged on, the taxes mounted, The casualty lists lengthened, and the country gentlemen who paid for it all began to grumble that the war was being prolonged for the profit and glory of the general and the moneyed men, that England was bleeding to enrich the Duke of Marlborough. The Tories made this grievance their own, and the Queen, who had never loved the war as Sarah loved it, listened. The closer the family climbed to the summit, the more enemies gathered below, and the heroism on the battlefields of Flanders, which should have made the Marlboroughs unassailable, instead became one more weight in the scale that was slowly tipping against them at home, where the real battle for the Queen's heart was being lost in the quiet of the back stairs. While her husband won the war abroad, she and the third member of the family alliance held the ground at home, and that third member deserves a word, for he was as much a part of the story as the Duke. Sidney, Lord Godolphin, was the Lord Treasurer, the man who managed the money of the kingdom and steered its business through Parliament, and he was bound to the Marlboroughs not only by politics but by deep friendship and soon by marriage, for his son married the Marlboroughs' eldest daughter, Godolphin Marlborough, and she formed what contemporaries half admiringly and half resentfully called the triumvirate that ran England. The two men managed the war and the treasury and the Parliament. She managed the one thing they could not reach without her, which was the Queen. For several years the system worked with remarkable smoothness. The victories rolled in, the money was found, the alliance held, and the family and Godolphin rose ever higher on the strength of it. Sarah, for her part, threw her energy into the work with all the fierce capacity of her nature, writing endless letters, pressing appointments, fighting the dynasty's battles at court, defending the war and the Whigs to the increasingly weary Queen. The war that Marlborough waged was the great cause of the age, a coalition of England, the Dutch, the Austrians and their allies, assembled to check the overwhelming power of France and to prevent one mighty king from bestriding the whole of Western Europe. It was an enormous undertaking, fought across years and across nations, demanding not only victories in the field but the endless patient labour of holding a quarrelsome alliance together, of finding the money, managing the politics at home, and Marlborough proved himself a master of all of it, soldier and diplomat and manager at once. After Blenheim the nation went wild with a joy it had not known in generations. The bells rang, the medals were struck, Parliament voted its thanks, and the name of Marlborough was set among the immortals, the first English commander in living memory to beat the French in the open field on the grand scale. Yet a war is a hungry thing, and a long war is a thankless one. The very greatness of the enterprise began in time to turn the nation against those who waged it. The fighting went on season after season, the taxes climbed, the lists of the dead grew longer, and the hard victory at the bloodiest of the battles sickened many at home who began to ask whether the slaughter was worth its end. The Tories made the peace their cause and the war the Whigs' burden, and the Queen, who had never shared Sarah's passion for the struggle, grew weary of the whole business and of the family whose glory was bound up with it. So it was that the more dazzling Marlborough's triumphs abroad, the more exposed they grew at home, until the hero of Europe and his fierce Duchess found that the ground had been cut from beneath them while they looked the other way. And yet, even at this high tide of the family's fortunes, the strain in Sarah's relations with Anne kept widening, because Sarah simply could not let the Queen alone. She had never learned, in all her years of intimacy, the one art that the new situation demanded, which was the art of yielding gracefully to a person who was now her sovereign. She argued with Anne about politics relentlessly. She wrote her long, scolding letters when the Queen would not do as Sarah thought she should. She made little secret of her contempt for the Tories and for the churchmen and country gentlemen whom Anne loved, and, increasingly, she simply was not there. She found the daily round of attendance on the Queen tedious, and she had her own great affairs to manage, her family, her building, her vast estates, so she absented herself from court for long stretches, leaving Anne alone. It was a fatal mistake, though Sarah did not see it as one, for a favourite's whole power rests on presence, on being the one who is there, and she, certain of a love she thought unbreakable, kept leaving the Queen's side. Into the empty space she left behind, day by day, quietly, attentively, with none of Sarah's heat and all of the soft compliance that she scorned, there stepped a poor relation whom she herself had brought to court, and who would prove to be the instrument of her undoing. But before we meet her properly, there is one more great prize to be told of, the prize that came after Blenheim, a gift from a grateful queen and nation, that should have crowned the family's glory, and that became instead a monument to Sarah's quarrels. In gratitude for the victory at Blenheim, Queen Anne gave the Duke of Marlborough one of the most magnificent rewards ever bestowed upon a subject. She granted him the old royal manor and park of Woodstock in Oxfordshire, many thousands of acres of fine country where the medieval kings had once kept a royal lodge and a hunting ground. And she promised, beyond the land, the money to raise upon it a vast house, a palace built at the nation's expense to stand forever as a monument to the victory and to the man who had won it. The house was to be named Blenheim, after the battle, so that the name of that far-off field in Germany would be carried down the centuries in English stone. It was a princely gift, the kind of thing a Roman republic might have given a conquering general, and it should have been the serene capstone of the Marlborough's rise. Instead, it became the cause of 2 decades of strife, much of it of Sarah's own making, and a good deal of that strife came down to a clash between the Duchess and the man chosen to design her palace. The grant itself was conceived as a thing of high romance, for the Queen gave the old royal manor of Woodstock to be held by a tenure fit for a hero, the rendering each year, in place of rent, of a single embroidered standard be laid up at Windsor on the anniversary of the great victory, a token rent that turned the whole estate into a perpetual monument to the day at Blenheim. Upon this storied ground, the great work was to rise, and the man chosen to raise it was the most original and ambitious architect of the age, a designer of soaring theatrical imagination who, with his gifted assistant, set about creating not a home but a piece of national sculpture, a baroque monument in golden stone meant to stand for centuries as England's answer to the palaces of the French king. It had humbled. For a time the Queen's enthusiasm and the nation's pride carried the great project forward on a tide of money, goodwill, and the foundations were laid with ceremony, and the walls began to climb. But a monument is one thing, and a home is another, and Sarah, who had to think of warmth and convenience and above all of cost, was at war with the whole conception from the start. She wanted a house her family could live in. The architect was building a temple to glory that no household could comfortably inhabit and that no fortune could easily pay for. The clash between the Duchess, who counted every pound, and the architect who dreamed in colonnades was bound to be bitter, and it grew more bitter still when the royal favour failed and the bills began to fall upon the family itself. The most magnificent building in England thus rose out of one of the longest and angriest quarrels in England, which is perhaps the most fitting origin imaginable for a monument to Sarah Churchill. The architect was Sir John Vanbrugh, a brilliant, theatrical, expansive man who conceived Blenheim not as a comfortable house, but as a heroic monument, vast, dramatic, piled up in great masses of carved stone, more like a temple to glory than a place to live. And in Sarah Churchill he met an immovable object. She wanted, she said, a convenient and a solid home, and she was appalled by the soaring cost and the slow pace and the sheer extravagance of Vanbrugh's design. She thought the whole conception ridiculous, the expense monstrous, the delays endless, and she suspected, in her sharp and suspicious way, that the architect and the builders were cheating her at every turn. She fought Vanbrugh over each stone and every bill, season after season, with a ferocity that wore both of them down, until at last the two were barely on speaking terms, and Vanbrugh, the creator of the vast house, was so estranged from its mistress that when in his old age he came to look upon his masterpiece, he was turned away from the gate by her servants and not permitted even to enter the park. It was a small and bitter thing, that turning away, but it stands as a kind of emblem of Sarah's whole character, the fierce, controlling, unforgiving energy that built great things and broke the people who built them with her. The sheer size of Blenheim is hard to convey, for it was conceived on a scale that no English subject had ever attempted, a palace to rival the seats of kings, set in a park of many thousands of acres, with a triumphal bridge and a great column and courts and colonnades, enough for a small town. It was meant to be a national monument as much as a home, a thing the whole country had given to honour its greatest soldier, and Vanbrugh designed it accordingly, in vast heroic masses of gold and stone that were magnificent to look upon and ruinously expensive and not at all comfortable to live in. To Sarah, who wanted a warm and convenient home for her family, the whole conception was a monstrous folly, and she fought it from the first stone to the last, with a ferocity that turned the building of a palace into a 30-year war. The quarrels were partly about taste and partly about money, but underneath them lay the deeper truth of Sarah's nature, which could not bear to be crossed or cheated, and saw waste and dishonesty everywhere it looked. She suspected the workman, distrusted the architect, scrutinized every account, and drove the entire enterprise forward by the same relentless will that had carried her to the heights of the court. When the Crown's money failed in the years of the family's disgrace, the colossal cost threatened to fall upon the Marlboroughs themselves, and Sarah's battles with the craftsmen turned into bitter lawsuits that dragged on for years. The house that was meant to crown the dynasty's glory became instead the great labour and grievance of her widowhood, a magnificent and joyless monument that she finished out of duty rather than love, and that stands to this day as the truest portrait in stone of the woman who refused to let a single thing go. There was, beneath the quarrels over money, a real and growing worry, for the promised funds from the Crown began to falter as the family's political fortunes declined, and the colossal cost of Blenheim threatened to fall upon the Marlboroughs themselves. The palace rose slowly, season by season, through political storms and royal coldness, and bitter disputes with workmen who went unpaid, and it would not be finished for a long time, not until the Duke and Duchess had been driven from court and from the country, and had come back again, and not until the Duke himself was near his end. The vast house that was meant to celebrate the dynasty's triumph instead measured out, in its long and troubled building, their slow decline, but all of that lay in the future. For now, in the middle years of the reign, the Marlboroughs were still riding high, the victories still came, the palace was rising, and the only cloud, small as a person's hand, was the steady cooling of the Queen's heart towards the friend who would not stop pushing her, and the steady warming of that same heart towards a quiet, soft-spoken, attentive woman who never pushed at all. It is time, at last, to meet her. Her name was Abigail Hill, and the cruelest irony of Sarah Churchill's whole life is that it was she who brought her to court. Abigail was a poor relation of Sarah's own, a cousin from a branch of the family that had fallen on hard times, and some years earlier Sarah, in a rare act of charity, had taken pity on the impoverished cousin and found her a humble place as a chamberwoman in the Queen's household. It was the sort of small kindness one did for a needy cousin, and she thought no more of it. But Abigail Hill was everything Sarah was not. Where the Duchess was dazzling, Abigail was plain and unobtrusive. where she was fierce and demanding. Abigail was gentle, patient, and endlessly obliging. Where she lectured and argued and absented herself, Abigail was always there, quiet at the Queen's side, soothing, attentive, asking nothing, content to sit for hours and listen and serve. To a tired, ailing, lonely Queen, worn down by years of being hectored by her brilliant friend, the soft and undemanding company of the chamberwoman was balm, and slowly, without anyone marking the moment it happened, Anna transferred to Abigail the trust and the affection she had once given wholly to her old friend. There was politics in it as well as feeling, for Abigail had a kinsman of her own, a subtle and ambitious Tory politician named Robert Harley, who saw in his quiet cousin's growing closeness to the Queen a golden road to power. Harley wished to break the grip of the Whigs and of the Marlborough connection upon the government, and through Abigail he now had a private channel straight to the Queen's ear, a channel that bypassed Sarah entirely. Day by day, the soft cousin and the clever politician worked their quiet influence, while Sarah, away from court on her own affairs, suspected nothing until the change was far advanced. When at last she understood what had happened, that the poor relation she had raised from obscurity had supplanted her in the Queen's heart, Sarah's reaction was not the calm reckoning of a wise woman, but the fury of a betrayed one. She raged. She confronted the Queen with bitter accusations. She wrote long, wounded, accusing letters, and in her rage she made every possible mistake, for the more she stormed and reproached, the more she proved to the weary Queen exactly why the gentle company of Abigail was the greater comfort, and the faster she drove Anne into the arms of her rival. The rise of Abigail had been quiet and patient, the very opposite of Sarah's stormy presence, and that was precisely its power. While she was away at her building or her estates, or simply absent from a court she found tedious, Abigail was there, every day and every hour, dressing the Queen, sitting with her, playing to her on the harpsichord in the long dull evenings, asking for nothing, and giving the one thing the Queen most craved, which was peace. In the year 1707, there came a sign of how far the new intimacy had gone, when the Queen attended Abigail's quiet wedding to a gentleman of the household, a small private matter of which Sarah, the great cousin who had raised Abigail from poverty, knew nothing until afterward. To learn that the Queen had been present at the secret marriage of her own poor relation, and had given the bride money from the privy purse that Sarah herself was supposed to keep, struck the Duchess like a blow, for it told her that a whole world of confidence had grown up at court, from which she, who had ruled that court for 20 years, was now shut out. Behind Abigail stood the cool and patient figure of Robert Harley, a politician of genius and subtlety who understood, as Sarah in her fury did not, that power in that reign flowed through the Queen's affections and could be captured by whoever the Queen found restful to be near. Harley used his quiet kinswoman as a channel to the royal ear, feeding the Queen's growing weariness with the Whigs and the war and the domineering Duchess, never pressing, always soothing, the perfect mirror of the gentle Abigail and the perfect opposite of the storming Duchess. Against this soft and steady undermining she had no weapon but her own temper, and her temper was the worst weapon she could have chosen, for every furious letter and every bitter scene only proved the case her enemies were making, that the Queen would be happier and calmer once she was free of her old friend. At last, the turning point that everyone remembered came in the summer of 1708, on a great public day. A solemn service of thanksgiving was to be held at St. Paul's Cathedral in London to celebrate yet another of Marlborough's victories, and the Queen rode in state through cheering crowds to give thanks for the triumphs of Sarah's own husband. As they made ready, she noticed that the Queen had not put on the jewels that Sarah, as mistress of the robes, had laid out for her to wear, and she chose to read this as a deliberate slight, the work, she was sure, of Abigail. But the two women fell to quarrelling about it in the coach and on the very steps of the cathedral, in front of the crowds and the leading men of the realm, and in the heat of it Sarah, forgetting entirely who and where she was, told the Queen of England to be quiet. To hush a sovereign in public on the steps of St. Paul's was a thing beyond forgiveness, and though the story may have grown in the telling, it captured perfectly the impossible position they had come to, the favourite still treating the Queen as the friend she might scold, the Queen no longer willing to be scolded by anyone. What made the quarrel at the cathedral so wounding was that it happened in the full glare of the public eye, on a day that should have been the family's greatest triumph, the very thanksgiving for the victories that Sarah's husband had won. To bicker with the Queen in the coach, before the watching crowds and the leading men of the realm, and then to hush her on the steps of the church, was to break every rule of the reverence owed to a sovereign, and though Anne said little in the moment, she did not forget. The thing that Sarah never grasped, even to the end of her life, was that the rules had changed under her feet, that the friend she had once been free to scold had become an anointed queen who could be scolded by no one, and that the very plainness of speech that Anne had once loved had become, now that Anne wore the crown, an unbearable presumption. It is one of the saddest patterns in the whole story, this inability of a brilliant woman to see the one thing she most needed to see. She had risen by being herself, fearless and frank and impossible to manage, and now the same qualities were destroying her, and she could not stop, because they were not a strategy she had chosen, but the very grain of her nature. She believed to her dying day that she had only ever told the Queen the truth, and that the truth was a service, and she never understood that a queen worn down by grief and illness and 20 years of being told the truth might come to long, above all things, for someone who would simply let her be. In trying to hold her friend by force, she lost her, and the harder she gripped, the faster the sand ran out between her fingers. Then, in the autumn of that same year, came a grief that should have drawn them back together, and instead tore them finally apart. Prince George of Denmark, the Queen's kindly, faithful husband of 25 years, fell ill and died, and Anne was plunged into a deep and genuine mourning. The Duchess came to her at Kensington in her hour of loss, but she came, even then, unable to set aside her own purposes and her own resentments. She pressed the grieving Queen on practical matters when Anne wanted only to sit with her sorrow. She is said to have ordered the removal of the dead prince's portrait from the Queen's room, thinking it would ease the pain when Anne wished it left, and when Anne, even in her grief, asked for Abigail to be sent to comfort her, she refused and reproached her instead. It was the final, unforgivable thing, to come between the Queen and her comfort at the very depth of her mourning. Whatever was left of the old love did not survive that season. The personal breach ran alongside a great turning of the public mood, and the two fed upon one another. The long war had soured. The country was weary of the taxes and the casualty lists, and a wave of feeling for the Church and the old Tory cause swept the nation, brought to a head when the government foolishly put a popular high church preacher on trial and turned him overnight into a hero whose name the crowds roared through the streets. The Queen, who had never loved the Whigs the Marlboroughs served, read the public mood as her own deliverance, and with the quiet Abigail at her side and the subtle Harley guiding her hand, she began to dismantle the whole structure of power that had rested upon her old friend, easing out the Whig ministers one by one and drawing the Tories in to make the peace the nation now craved. In this great shift, the fall of the favourite and the fall of the ministry became a single movement, for they had always been one thing. As long as Sarah held the Queen, The war and the Whigs and the Marlborough connection held their ground. Once the Queen's heart had turned, the whole edifice came down together. Sarah, fighting for her friendship, was fighting also, though she scarcely separated the two, for a whole system of government, and she was losing both at once. Every furious letter she wrote, every scene she made, every reproach she heaped upon the Queen, and confirmed Anne in the course she had chosen and hastened the end. The woman who had stood at the centre of the kingdom was being moved, gently and inexorably, to its edge, and there was nothing her formidable will could do to stop it, because the one thing that could have saved her, a softer and a humbler temper, was the one thing she did not possess. The end, when it came, was quiet, and it was final. For a while the forms were kept up, the Duchess still holding her high offices, the Duke still winning his battles abroad, but the heart had gone out of it entirely on the Queen's side, and Anne now wanted only to be free of her old friend. In the spring of 1710, the Duchess obtained one last private interview with the Queen at Kensington, hoping even then to win back what was lost. It did not go as she wished. Anne, pressed and reproached, would say almost nothing, only repeating over and over, with the flat stubbornness of a woman whose mind is wholly made up, that the Duchess might put anything she had to say in writing, and that she, Anne, would give her no answer. She pleaded. The Queen repeated her cold formula, and would be moved no further, and so they parted, the two women who had loved each other for 30 years, who had been Mrs. Morley and Mrs. Freeman, who had fled into the night together, and grieved together, and risen together to the heights of the world. They never saw one another again. The following winter the blow fell in form as well as in feeling. The Queen sent word that the Duchess was to give up her offices and surrender the gold key that was the badge of her place in the bedchamber. The Duke, Sarah's husband, came on his knees to the Queen to beg even a little delay, a few days' grace, and Anne would grant nothing, and she, in a last gesture of the proud temper that had carried her so high and brought her so low, took the gold key and flung it down, and bade her husband carry it back to the Queen at once. With that small, hard sound of metal on the floor, the greatest friendship of the age was over, and the long second half of Sarah Churchill's life, the half lived in the cold outside the door she had once commanded, began. The fall of the favourite was followed quickly by the fall of the whole connection that had rested upon her, for the two had always been bound together. With Sarah gone from the bedchamber and Abigail and Harley triumphant, the Tories swept into power. Godolphin, the old friend and Lord Treasurer, was dismissed. The Whigs were turned out. And at the end of the year 1711, the Queen at last brought down the greatest man of the age himself. The Duke of Marlborough, the victor of Blenheim, and a dozen other fields, the man who had carried England's arms to a height never reached before, was dismissed from all his commands, accused by his political enemies of taking money corruptly from army contracts, charges that were largely a pretext to be rid of him. The general who had won the war was cast aside before it was even ended, so that the new ministers could make their peace with France. It was an ungrateful business, and the country knew it. But the Tories held the Queen, and the Queen had no more love for the Marlboroughs, and so it was done. The family that had stood at the very summit of the kingdom found itself, within the space of 2 years, stripped of office, of favour, of income, and of honour. The completeness of the fall is worth measuring, for it came down within a very short span upon a family that had seemed only a season before to stand beyond the reach of any enemy. First the favourite was driven from the bedchamber, then the Queen turned out the whole Whig ministry that had rested upon the Marlborough connection, calling Harley and his friends to power and making the peace with France that the Tories had long desired. The great alliance that had won the war was abandoned. The Duke who had led it was recalled and disgraced, and the family that had governed England found itself, in the space of 2 years, reduced to private people, watched with open hostility by the men now in power. The wheel of fortune which the Marlboroughs had ridden so high had come round at last to the bottom. There is a famous and revealing detail from the end, which is that when Sarah was finally forced to quit her lodgings at the royal palace, she stripped them on her way out, carrying off the very fittings, the brass locks and the marble chimney pieces, in a last act of furious possessiveness over what she felt had been hers. The Queen, hearing of it, is said to have refused to let any further work be done on the unfinished palace at Blenheim until the Duchess's own lodgings were made good, so that the two women, who had once written each other letters of undying love, ended by quarrelling over fixtures and fittings like the bitterest of strangers. It was a small and ignoble end to a great intimacy, and it showed how completely the warmth of 30 years had turned to stone. There was, too, the small grinding matter of the money, which suited the temper of both women in their bitterness. As keeper of the privy purse, she had handled vast sums of the Queen's private money over many years, and now her enemies hinted that she had not handled it honestly. The Duchess, stung to fury by any charge against her honesty, fought back in the only way she knew, with documents and accounts and a ferocious insistence on her own rectitude. She produced her books to show that she had kept everything in order, and she pressed, in turn, a claim of her own, that a vast sum was owed to her in arrears and allowances. The wrangling over the privy purse money dragged on and left a sour taste, the once loving friends now reduced to disputing pounds and pence through lawyers and officials. It was a small and undignified coda to a great intimacy, and it showed how completely the warmth had turned to ice. The woman who had held the Queen's heart now haggled with her over an account book. Out of office, out of favour, watched with suspicion by a hostile government, and weary of a country that had turned against them, the Duke and Duchess of Marlborough at length decided to leave England altogether. There was nothing to keep them but trouble. The Duke's enemies were pressing, and there was even talk of further proceedings against him. And so, in the last years of Queen Anne's reign, the greatest soldier in Europe and his fierce, fallen Duchess packed up their lives and went abroad into a kind of voluntary exile, to wait out the hostility of the times in foreign towns, far from the court that had made and unmade them, and far from the half-built palace that stood, its scaffolding silent and its workmen unpaid, as a monument now not to triumph but to a glory that had curdled into disgrace. The years of exile, from about 1712, carried the Marlboroughs across the Low Countries and into Germany, to cities where the Duke was still honoured as the great captain he was, even while his own country had cast him off. They lived for a time in the great merchant city of Antwerp, and they travelled on to Frankfurt, and in the towns of the continent the old soldier was received with the respect that England had denied him, princes and magistrates turning out to greet the conqueror of Blenheim. It was in its way a strange and not wholly unhappy interlude, the two of them thrown back upon one another's company as they had not been for years, the daily storms of court left behind, a marriage that had survived everything still holding firm in their late middle age. But it was exile all the same, a life lived in borrowed lodgings and foreign streets, watching England from across the sea, waiting for the wheel to turn. The exile carried its own dangers and its own strange honours. Abroad, the Duke was still the most famous soldier in Europe, and the courts and cities of the continent received him with a respect that made the ingratitude of his own country sting all the more. Princes coming out to meet the conqueror of Blenheim while at home his enemies blackened his name. Yet there was peril in it too, for these were the years when the exiled Stuart claimant across the water still hoped to overturn the settlement and take back his father's throne, and a supreme soldier abroad, out of favour at home, was a piece that every player wished to use. The Marlboroughs had to walk carefully, keeping their true loyalty to the Protestant succession clear while not provoking the government that had driven them out, and she, for all her grief at the exile, never lost her grip on the essential calculation that their future lay with Hanover and not with the doomed cause of the old king's son. For Sarah herself, the wandering years were a kind of enforced rest after a lifetime of storms, and not, perhaps, an entirely unhappy one, for she had her husband to herself as she had not had him in decades, free of the court and its endless intrigues. But she chafed at the smallness of it, the borrowed houses, the foreign tongues, the distance from the great affairs she had been bred to manage, and she longed for the turn of events that would carry them home in triumph. That turn, she knew, depended on a single failing life, on the slow decline of the ailing queen who had cast her off, and so the Marlboroughs in their exile waited, with a patience that had in it something grim, for the death that would open the door back into England and into power. For Sarah, the exile was bearable chiefly because she never doubted that it would end, and end well, for one simple reason. The Queen was ailing, and the Queen had no heir of her body. When Anne died, the crown would pass by the Act of Settlement to the Protestant House of Hanover in Germany, to the old Electress Sophia, or, as it turned out, to her son George. And the Elector of Hanover had no love at all for the Tory ministers who had made a separate peace with France, and had treated his future subjects so shabbily. The men who had ruined the Marlboroughs were the very men the next king would distrust, and the Marlboroughs, cast out by the dying Stuart, were natural friends to the rising Hanoverian. She and her husband, watching from abroad, understood this perfectly, and they kept their lines open to Hanover and bided their time. Their exile was not a defeat to be endured forever, but a season to be waited out. And the thing they were waiting for was a death. And so they watched through the year 1714, as the news from England grew graver, as the Queen's health failed, as the leading men in London manoeuvred for the moment of the succession. The Duke timed his return with a soldier's care, crossing back towards England as the crisis came to its head, ready to be on hand when the throne changed hands. He need not have hurried in the end, for the matter settled itself with a smoothness few had dared to hope for. But before we follow the Marlboroughs home into the new reign and the long aftermath of their lives, we must pause on the death of the woman who had been the centre of Sarah's whole existence, the friend turned stranger, the Queen who went to her grave with the bitter quarrel unhealed and the gold key never taken up again. Anne, Queen of Great Britain, for so she had become after the union of England and Scotland in her reign, died on the 1st day of August in the year 1714. She was only 49, but she was worn out, her body broken by the long stretches of illness and the 17 heartbreaking childbirths that had left her with no living child, swollen and lame and exhausted, an old woman before her time. She died with her kingdom at peace, and the Protestant succession secure, which were no small achievements, but she died estranged from almost everyone who had once been close to her, and above all, she went to her grave without ever having spoken again to Sarah Churchill. The two women had not met since that last cold interview at Kensington 4 years before. There had been no reconciliation, no softening, no deathbed forgiveness on either side. The friendship that had begun when they were both young and lonely, that had been the great love of Anne's life and the foundation of Sarah's greatness, simply ended in silence, and the silence was never broken. The manner of the Queen's last days had its own drama, for the succession hung in real doubt until almost the final hour. The Tory ministers were divided and frightened, some of them secretly in touch with the exiled Stuart claimant, and there was a genuine fear that the death of the Queen might be the signal for a disputed succession or even a rising. In the event, The leading men who were determined upon the Protestant line acted with speed and nerve at the deathbed, and the machinery set up by the Act of Settlement worked smoothly, so that when Anne died, the Elector of Hanover was proclaimed King George I with scarcely a ripple, and the long-feared crisis passed off into anticlimax. The Stuart cause, for which so many still secretly hoped, had missed its moment, and the throne passed peacefully to the German prince, who owed nothing to the men who had ruined the Marlboroughs. For Sarah, the death that she had waited out in exile was the key that unlocked everything, and yet it must have come to her tangled with a grief she could never quite untangle from her anger. The friend of her youth, the queen who had loved her and cast her off, was gone forever, and with her went any last impossible hope of the reconciliation that Sarah would spend the rest of her life arguing she had deserved. She had won, in the worldly sense, for her enemies were about to fall and her family was about to be restored, but the person she had most wanted to win back was now beyond all winning, carried off into a silence that no memoir and no letter and no lawsuit could ever reach. The triumph and the loss arrived in the same dispatch, and Sarah, sailing home to greatness, sailed home also into a widowed sort of victory. It is one of the saddest things in this whole story, that two people who had loved one another so deeply should let pride and politics carry them so far apart that they could not find their way back even at the end. What the Duchess felt at the news we can only guess, for her own later writings on the subject are so tangled with self-justification and old anger that it is hard to find the simple grief in them. She had loved Anne in her difficult way, and she had also been wounded past bearing by Anne's withdrawal of that love, and the two feelings warred in her for the rest of her life. She would spend much of her remaining 30 years going back over the quarrel, again and again, in letters and in memoirs, trying to set down her version of it, trying to prove that the fault had all been Anne's, or Abigail's, or Harley's, and never her own. It was the wound that never healed, and she could not leave it alone. But whatever was in Sarah's heart, the death of the Queen meant, in the hard terms of the world, the complete reversal of the family's fortunes, for the very next act of the story was the arrival of a king who was the enemy of their enemies. The new sovereign was George I, the Elector of Hanover, a German prince who spoke little English and cared little for the country he had come to rule, but who knew very well who his friends and his enemies in England were. The Tory ministers who had made the peace with France fell at once from power, some of them fleeing abroad to escape worse, and the Whigs, the party of the Marlboroughs, came back into favour with the new dynasty, the Duke and Duchess of Marlborough, who had timed their return to coincide almost exactly with the old Queen's death, came home to England, not as disgraced exiles, but as honoured friends of the new king. The Duke was restored to his offices and his honours. The cloud was lifted. The long winter of their disgrace was over, and they were great again, or great enough, in the new world that had dawned. But Sarah was a different woman now from the favourite who had ruled a queen, and the second half of her long life would be lived not in the warm centre of a court, but in the cooler, lonelier country of immense wealth, fierce independence, and an ever-lengthening list of enemies. The first thing she set her formidable will to, now that the family was restored, was the finishing of the great half-built palace that had been the cause of so much of her grief. When the Crown's money had dried up in the years of disgrace, the building of Blenheim had stopped, leaving the vast house standing unfinished, a roofless shell in places, the workmen unpaid, and the whole grand project becalmed. Now the Marlboroughs resolved to complete it themselves, out of their own enormous fortune, and the task fell in large part to Sarah, for the Duke was ageing, and would soon be unable to manage anything at all. She threw herself into it with all her old ferocity, but it was a joyless labour, undertaken less out of love for the place than out of duty to her husband's glory, and a stubborn refusal to leave anything she had begun unfinished. She battled the workmen over their bills. She battled the architect Vanbrugh until he abandoned the project altogether, leaving others to carry out his designs. She economized and disputed and drove the work forward by sheer force of will, and slowly the great pile of stone at Woodstock rose to its full height and was at last made whole, the most enormous private residence in England, a monument the size of a small town raised to commemorate a single afternoon's battle in Germany. The completion of Blenheim was a saga of bitterness as much as of building. With the Crown's money long since cut off, the enormous cost fell upon the family, and Sarah, who had hated the design from the first, now had to pay for it, which sharpened her every quarrel with the men who had built it. There were lawsuits with the craftsmen, the most famous of them with the very masons and carvers whose work adorned the place, disputes that dragged through the courts for years as the Duchess fought every bill and every claim with the same ferocity she had once spent on the politics of the bedchamber. She believed, as she always believed, that she was being cheated, and she may sometimes have been right, but the effect was to leave the vast pile ringing with grievance, even as it rose to its full magnificence. Through it all, the palace was at last made whole, and whatever Sarah felt about it, it stood and stands as one of the wonders of England, a baroque mountain of golden stone set in its vast green park, the only house in the country not belonging to a bishop or a king that is called a palace. It had been meant as a gift from a grateful nation to its greatest soldier, and it had become, in the building, a 40-year monument to the iron will of his wife, who had not wanted it, had not designed it, had fought it at each turn, and had finished it all the same out of a stubborn refusal to leave her husband's glory half-built. That contradiction, the magnificent thing raised in joyless struggle, is so perfectly Sarah that the house could hardly stand for anyone else. It is worth standing back for a moment to consider what Blenheim came to mean in Sarah's long life, because the vast palace is in some ways the truest portrait of her. She had not wanted it built as it was built. She thought it absurd, uncomfortable, ruinously dear, the vanity of an architect rather than a home for a family. And yet she gave decades of her life to raising it, fighting every inch of the way, and in the end it stood, magnificent and cold and overwhelming, exactly the sort of monument that swallows the people who make it. There is a hardness in the achievement, the same hardness that ran through everything Sarah did, the will that could not rest, the eye that saw waste and dishonesty everywhere, the refusal ever to yield or to let a thing go. She built one of the wonders of England and made an enemy of the man who designed it, and found little joy in the result. That, in stone, is Sarah Churchill. But the finishing of Blenheim took many years, and it ran on alongside a slower and sadder labour, the long decline of the man for whose glory the whole vast house had been raised. For even as the palace at last climbed towards completion, the great Duke himself was failing, the mighty soldier who had never lost a battle now losing, by slow degrees, the strength of his own body and the sharpness of his own mind. And it is to that long farewell, the closing of the great partnership that had been the steadiest thing in Sarah's whole stormy life, that we must turn next. In the year 1716, the Duke of Marlborough suffered the first of a series of strokes. The disease that struck him down was the cruelest possible fate for such a man, for it took not his courage or his fame, but his speech and his power of mind, leaving the greatest commander of the age unable at times to find his words, dependent, diminished, a shadow of the towering figure who had directed armies across a continent. He lingered on for some 6 years in this failing state, partially recovering and then sinking again with each fresh stroke, and through all that time Sarah nursed him. Here, in the long sick room of her husband's decline, we see the other side of Sarah Churchill, the side the quarrels and the lawsuits hide. Whatever her ferocity towards the rest of the world, towards John she was tender to the last. She watched over him, managed his comfort, guarded him from those she thought would trouble or cheat him, and stayed close by him through the slow dimming of the man she had loved for more than 40 years. The marriage that had begun in secret in the winter of a long-ago year, that had been carried on across battlefields and through letters, and held firm through triumph and disgrace, came down at the end to a wife sitting beside the bed of a failing husband, and it held even there. The end came in the summer of 1722. The old Duke, worn out at last, died in the early morning of the 16th of June at one of their houses near Windsor, with Sarah and 2 of their surviving daughters beside him. He was 72 years old. He had been, by any reckoning, one of the greatest soldiers his country ever produced. A man who had never fought a battle he did not win, nor besieged a town he did not take, and his death was mourned as the passing of a national hero. For the Duchess it was something simpler and harder than the loss of a hero. It was the loss of the one human being who had loved her, without reserve and without interruption, for the whole of her adult life. The one person whose devotion had never wavered, never cooled, never turned to ice as Anne's had done. The Duke was buried with all the pomp that a grateful nation, its ingratitude now safely in the past, could heap upon a fallen hero. The funeral was a vast state occasion, the streets lined with soldiers and crowds, the procession winding through London to the Abbey where he was first laid to rest, the whole country uniting in the death of the man it had cheered and then cast off, and now chose to remember only as a hero. For Sarah, watching the great spectacle, the grief beneath the ceremony was simple and absolute, for she had lost the one fixed point of her whole existence, the man whose love had been the single thing in her life that never failed her, never turned, never had to be fought for or won back. In the long stretches of her widowhood, she kept his memory with a devotion that was almost fierce, guarding his reputation, commissioning the histories that would honour him, and in time arranging that he should be moved from the Abbey to lie at Blenheim, the palace built in his name, where she herself would one day be brought to lie beside him. She had quarrelled with almost everyone in her life, with her queen, her children, her architects, her ministers, but with John she had never truly quarrelled, and his death left her without the one person who had been able to soften and steady her. The rest of her life was lived in his shadow and in his memory, and the devotion she had given him while he lived, she guarded all the more fiercely now that he was gone, holding to it through all the long widowhood that remained to her. She was 62 years old, and she would live for another 22 years, and she never married again, though she had offers enough, and she kept his memory and guarded his glory with a fierce and lasting devotion. She had outlived the queen who had cast her off, and now she had outlived the husband who had never let her go, and she faced the long last act of her days alone, a widow of immense wealth, formidable temper, and very few friends. The fortune she was left to command was almost beyond reckoning. The grateful state had settled vast sums and great revenues upon the Marlboroughs in the days of their glory, and the careful management of the family's money, much of it Sarah's own work, had multiplied it many times over. The Duke had died one of the richest men in England, and he left the bulk of it, with great trust, in the hands of his redoubtable widow. Sarah Churchill, the portionless maid of honour from the house by the water, was now one of the wealthiest women in all of Europe, mistress of a vast fortune, of broad estates, of the great new palace at Blenheim, and of a freedom that her riches and her widowhood together conferred upon her. the rare and dangerous freedom of a woman answerable to no one at all. What she did with that freedom across the long stretches that remained is the story of the last chapters of her life. She used it, first of all, to manage her affairs with a skill and an attention that would have done credit to any merchant in the city of London. She had a head for money that was rare in anyone of her rank and almost unheard of in a woman of her age, and as a widow she devoted her formidable energies to the building and guarding of her wealth. She oversaw her estates herself, scrutinized every account, drove hard bargains, lent money at interest, and invested with a shrewdness that steadily increased what was already a colossal fortune. She bought land across many counties until she held more estates than she could easily count, and she watched over the great trust her husband had left with a vigilance that missed nothing. She was, in this, entirely modern, a woman of business in an age that gave women almost no scope for it, and she succeeded at it precisely because of the qualities that made her so difficult as a friend, the suspicion that assumed everyone was cheating her, the refusal to be deceived, the relentless, tireless attention to detail. The same hard eye that had fought Vanbrugh over every stone of Blenheim now multiplied her millions, and by the end of her life she was richer by far than she had ever been at the height of her power at court. Her financial gifts were genuinely remarkable, and they set her apart from almost everyone of her rank and her sex in that age. Where most of the great aristocratic fortunes were sunk in land and bled by debt and extravagance, she managed hers like a man of business in the city, watching the markets, lending at interest, buying land cheaply and improving it, and moving her money with a shrewdness that steadily multiplied it through decades when many older fortunes were shrinking. She is said to have understood the new world of public credit and investment better than most of the men who ran it, and she put her wealth to work in the funds and the loans that financed the very state that had once disgraced her, so that the woman who had been driven from court ended by being one of its largest private creditors. The result was a fortune of a size that astonished even that age of great estates, spread across many counties, and held with a vigilance that never relaxed. She knew, she said, the value of money because she had grown up without enough of it, and the anxious arithmetic of her Hertfordshire childhood had become in her old age a mastery so complete that she could have bought and sold most of the dukes who looked down on her birth. Yet there is something cold at the heart of it, for the money was in the end power with nowhere left to go, a vast accumulation in the hands of a woman who had outlived the court and the friends and the husband through whom power had once flowed, and who now had nothing to spend her formidable energy upon but the guarding of the hoard and the waging of her quarrels. But money was never the whole of it, for what Sarah truly possessed in her widowhood, and what she could never quite find a use for, was power without a place to spend it. All her life her power had run through other people, through Anne, through her husband, through the great connection of the triumvirate. And now they were all gone, and she was left with wealth and will and energy and nowhere to put them but into the affairs of her own family and the quarrels of her own making. She meddled in the marriages and fortunes of her children and grandchildren. She involved herself, from the sidelines, in the politics of the new reigns, dispensing scorn upon the ministers of the day, with a freedom that her independence allowed, for she needed nothing from anyone and feared no one. She was a great power still, in her way, but a power turned in upon itself, a force with no outlet, and a nature like Sarah's denied its proper field will always find a smaller and a sharper one. The fields she found were her own relations and her own grievances, and the next chapter of her story is the long tale of her quarrels which became, in her old age, almost a way of life. She quarrelled, it sometimes seems, with very nearly everyone. She quarrelled with her own daughters, bitterly and lastingly, falling out with them over money, over marriages, over politics, over the management of the family, until she was estranged from more than one of her children and would not speak their names. She quarrelled with the architects and builders she employed on her various houses, suing them, abusing them, accusing them of fraud, as she had quarrelled with Vanbrugh. She quarrelled with ministers of state and with the royal family of the new dynasty. She conducted her feuds in long, furious letters and in expensive lawsuits, and in the rewriting, again and again, of her will, which she altered many times over to reward those who had pleased her, and to strike out those who had crossed her. She was a difficult, exacting, suspicious old woman, and she knew it, and she did not greatly care, for she had reached a height of wealth and independence from which she felt she need answer to no one, for her temper. The catalogue of her later quarrels reads almost like a comedy, except that real affection was wrecked in it. She fell out lastingly with her own surviving daughters, above all with her eldest, until the two were barely on speaking terms, and the old Duchess spoke of her child with a bitterness that shocked even her hardened friends. She quarrelled with the chief minister of the day and with the royal family of the new dynasty, abusing them freely from the safety of her independence, for she needed nothing from any of them, and feared none of them. She built herself a fine house in London near the royal palace, and quarrelled with the architects over that too, and she kept a villa in the country, and rewrote her will so many times, striking out the offenders and restoring the forgiven, that the changes ran into the dozens, a paper record of every friendship made and broken in her long old age. Set against all this, though, there was a real grandeur in her refusal ever to court favour or to flatter the powerful, even when flattery would have served her interests well. She had begun her life by declining to fawn upon the great, and she ended it in the same spirit, falling out with the new kings and their ministers rather than bend to them, speaking her mind to royalty itself as freely as she had once spoken it within her own queen's closet. She wanted nothing from the court of the Hanoverians, and she took care to let them know it, and there was a kind of magnificence in the spectacle of the old woman who had been the supreme favourite of the age now disdaining the whole business of favour, asking for nothing, fearing no one, beholden to none. The same iron that had made her so hard to live with had made her also, in her fierce old age, very nearly untouchable, and that hard freedom was the thing she had prized, in the end, above rank and above wealth alike. And yet it would be unjust to leave the picture there as a mere portrait of a rich and bitter old woman, for there was grandeur in her independence, as well as harshness. The most famous instance of it came when she was a widow of some years, and still, despite her age and her temper, a great matrimonial prize on account of her fortune. She received more than one offer of marriage, and among those who sought her hand was the Duke of Somerset, one of the proudest noblemen in England, a man of the very highest rank. To marry him would have made her a duchess twice over, and tied her to one of the foremost houses of the land. She refused him, and she refused him in words that ring down the years and tell you everything about how she saw herself. She would not, she said, were she young and beautiful again instead of old, give to the Duke of Somerset that heart and hand that had once belonged to John, Duke of Marlborough. She would not put it in any man's power to call himself master of the widow of the greatest soldier in Europe. She had been the wife of a hero, and she would be no less a man's wife, and she preferred her independence and her own name to any new grandeur a husband could bring. It was pride, certainly, but it was also a kind of fidelity, and there is something magnificent in it, the old Duchess turning away the proudest duke in England because no living man could match the dead one she had loved. She lived in her vast houses, at Blenheim and at Marlborough House in London, the fine town mansion she had built near the royal palace, and at her villa at Wimbledon, surrounded by her wealth and her servants and her grievances, growing old, growing frail in body, but never for one moment losing the sharpness of her mind or the fierceness of her will. And as she aged, with the bitter quarrel of her life still gnawing at her after all the decades, she set herself to the task that would occupy much of her last years and shape how the world would remember her. The task of telling her own side of the story, of setting down in writing her account of Anne and Abigail and the favour and the fall, so that posterity should know that the fault had not, whatever people said, been in hers. For years she laboured over her memoirs, with the help of others who shaped her recollections into order, for she remained uneasy about her own writing to the end. And in the year 1742, when she was past 80 years old, she published the book that set out her version of the great affair of her life, under a long title that began with the words, An Account of the Conduct of the Dowager Duchess of Marlborough. It was, in essence, the case for the defence, the old woman's argument delivered to the public after most of the other actors in the drama were long dead, that she had been a faithful and honest servant of a queen who had been weak, ungrateful, and led astray by lesser people. She had kept her letters, all those hundreds of letters in which Anne had once poured out her love to her dear Mrs. Freeman, and she used them now, laying out the evidence of how deeply she had once been loved as proof of how cruelly she had later been wronged. It caused a great stir when it appeared, this voice out of the past reopening the quarrels of a vanished reign, and it has shaped the way the story has been told ever since. For Sarah, by writing the first and fullest account, fixed her own version of events into the record where it has remained, half believed and half resisted, by every writer who has come after. The writing of the book was itself a long labour, for Sarah, uneasy about her own pen to the last, worked with men of letters who helped to shape her flood of recollection and grievance into a connected narrative, and she fussed and quarrelled over it as she fussed and quarrelled over everything. When it appeared, it caused a sensation, for here was the voice of the old reign speaking out of the past, naming names, settling scores, throwing open the private letters of a dead queen to the public gaze, and doing it all with a vigour and a directness that no ghostwriter could quite tame. The reading public devoured it. Her enemies and their descendants rushed to answer it, and the long argument over who had been to blame for the bitter quarrel, an argument that still goes on among historians, was set in motion by this fierce old woman determined to have the last word. It is a strange and valuable book, and the strangeness and the value come from the same source, which is that it is utterly partial and utterly alive. As history it must be read with caution, for it sees everything through the single eye of Sarah's grievance, and allows her almost no fault of her own. As a portrait of a personality, it is beyond price, for the woman springs off the page exactly as she must have been in the room, certain, scornful, wounded, magnificent, never, for one sentence, in any doubt that she had been right, and the rest of the world wrong. She had been silenced once, when the Queen sent her away with the instruction to put everything in writing and receive no answer. And now, decades later, she had put it all in writing for the whole world to see, and there was no one left alive who could send her away again. We should weigh the book honestly, for it is both precious and unreliable, which is exactly what we should expect from such a source. On the one hand, it preserves a vast store of letters and detail about the inner life of a great court that would otherwise be lost, and no one who wishes to understand the reign of Anne can do without it. On the other hand, it is the work of a fierce and partial woman determined to justify herself, and it sees everything through the single lens of her own grievance, blaming Anne, blaming Abigail, blaming Harley, and never, or almost never, allowing that her own pride and temper and relentless pushing might have had any part in the ruin of the friendship. The truth, as truth usually does, lay somewhere between Sarah's account and her enemy's answers to it. She had been wronged, and she had also wronged. She had been the victim of a quiet conspiracy, and she had also driven the Queen into its arms by her own ungovernable nature. The memoir cannot be trusted as a plain record, but it can be trusted absolutely as a portrait of its author, for in its very unfairness, its energy, its refusal to yield an inch, its certainty that she had always been in the right, it is Sarah Churchill complete, the same woman at past 80 that she had been as a girl who answered a princess back. By the time the book appeared, she was very old, and the great drama of her life had passed into history, the Queen 40 years dead, the Duke 20 years gone, the friends and the enemies of her glory days nearly all in their graves while she lived stubbornly on. She had become a kind of relic of a vanished age, the last living link to the court of Queen Anne and the wars of Marlborough, a famous, formidable, much feared old woman whom a younger generation regarded with a mixture of awe and alarm. And it is to those last years, the long sunset of the longest lived of all the great figures of her time, that we come now, as the fierce flame at last burns down towards its end. Old age did not soften Sarah Churchill, but it did, here and there, reveal the warmth that her long wars had hidden. For all the children she had quarrelled with, she lavished a real and tender love on certain of her grandchildren, and above all on one granddaughter, Lady Diana Spencer, a gentle and charming girl whom the old Duchess doted on, and to whom she left a great share of her affection and her fortune. There is something touching in the picture of the terrible old woman who had frightened ministers and refused dukes and outlived an age, growing soft over a favourite granddaughter, planning her future, delighting in her company. It is a reminder that the same fierce capacity for love that had bound her to Anne and to John all that time before had never died in her, only narrowed, in her isolation, to the few she still let close. She kept her mind to the very end, sharp and clear and unforgiving, dictating letters, managing her affairs, altering her will, holding court in her vast houses as a kind of living monument to a vanished world. In these last years, the great Whig families of the next age came to her for her money and her blessing, and the threads of the future ran out from the old woman's drawing-room in ways she could not have foreseen. The granddaughter she loved best, the gentle Lady Diana, she hoped to marry to the rising young politician who would one day lead the nation, and though that particular scheme came to nothing, Diana's own line, and the lines of Sarah's other grandchildren, would weave the blood of the Churchills and the Spencers into the heart of the English aristocracy for centuries to come. Sarah, dispensing fortunes and withholding them, arranging matches and breaking them, sat at the centre of this web like a fierce old spider, her wealth giving her a power over the young that her years had not diminished. Her sharpness of tongue never left her, and the anecdotes of her old age are famous, the old Duchess saying exactly what she thought of the king and his ministers and his mistresses, fearless and funny and merciless to the end. She had become a kind of national monument, the last survivor of the heroic age of Queen Anne, a living link to a world that the younger generation knew only from books, and people came to look at her as they might come to look at some great relic, half in awe and half in terror. She was lame and ill and very old, racked by gout and other miseries that she bore with the same impatient courage she had brought to everything. But the mind inside the failing body stayed clear and hard and bright as a blade, and she went on managing her millions and waging her quarrels and altering her will almost to the very last day of a life that had now stretched across the better part of a century. Her body, though, was failing at last, worn down by the great age she had reached by gout and other ailments that tormented her final years, and that she bore with the same impatient courage she had brought to everything else. She had lived through an astonishing sweep of history. She had been born in the year the monarchy was restored under Charles II, and she had seen the reigns of his brother James, of William and Mary, of her beloved and estranged Anne, of the first two Georges of the House of Hanover. She had known the court as a girl when it was the playground of the Merry King, and she lived to see a different England altogether, more sober, more commercial, more modern. Kings and queens and ministers and soldiers whose names had filled the world had risen and fallen and died all around her, and still she went on, the last of them, upright and unbending, and entirely herself. The end came on the 18th day of October in the year 1744. Sarah Churchill, Duchess of Marlborough, died at last at Marlborough House, the great London mansion she had built, in the 85th year of her life. She had outlived almost everyone who had shared her great years, outlived the Queen who cast her off by 30 years, and the husband who never did by 22, outlived her enemies and many of her friends and several of her own children. She was carried at last to Blenheim, the vast and troublesome palace that had cost her so much grief and so many quarrels, and there she was laid to rest, and there in time her husband, the great Duke, was brought to lie beside her, the two of them together again at the end beneath the enormous monument that bore the name of his greatest victory. The portionless girl from the house by the water in Hertfordshire, who had risen on her wit and her nerve and won extraordinary friendship to rule the heart of a queen and stand at the summit of a kingdom, was gone, and an age went with her. What she had been, and what she left behind, is the last thing for us to weigh gently before the night closes over the story. What she left, in the plainest terms, was a good deal. She left one of the largest private fortunes in the kingdom, which passed down through her family and helped sustain the House of Marlborough for generations. She bequeathed Blenheim Palace, finished at last by her own hard will, one of the wonders of England, where her descendants live to this day, and where long after her death another and even more famous Churchill would be born, a son of the line she had founded who would lead his country through its darkest war. She passed on her memoirs and her thousands of letters, an unmatched record of a great age seen from the very centre of power, the raw material from which her whole story, and much of the story of her times, has been written ever since. And she handed down a name that has never been forgotten, the very pattern and definition of the royal favourite, the subject who rose higher than any subject should on nothing but the love of a sovereign, and who fell when that love was lost. The line she founded would carry her blood and her name down through the centuries in ways that would have satisfied even her enormous ambition. From the union of the Churchills and the Spencers, through the granddaughter she doted on, and the other grandchildren she alternately favoured and disinherited, descended a great swat of the English governing class, and from the same stock, generations later, would come the most famous Churchill of all, the man who would lead his country through its darkest hour, and who was born within the walls of the very palace that Sarah had finished in her grief. The fortune she had guarded so fiercely passed down to sustain the family she had built, and the house at Blenheim still stands, the great memorial not only to a soldier's victories, but to a wife's unbreakable will. She had founded a dynasty out of a love match between two people who had nothing, and she had done it by her own gifts as much as by her husband's sword, for it was Sarah's management of the money and Sarah's hold upon the Queen that had carried the family to the summit, and Sarah's grim persistence that had held what was won. The girl from the house by the water had ended as the richest woman in the kingdom and the ancestress of its leaders, and if she had lost along the way the friendship that had made her, she had also proved, beyond any argument, that a woman of no fortune and no schooling could rise as high as any man in the land on nothing but her own nerve, her own wit, and her own refusal ever to bend. That is no small monument, and it is the one she would have chosen for herself. The harder question is what to make of the woman herself, and here we should be fair to her, and fair also to those she trampled, for she was not a simple character, and she does not deserve a simple verdict. She was, beyond doubt, difficult, domineering, suspicious, quarrelsome, and proud past all reason. She drove away her queen, her children, her architect, and half the people who came within her reach, and a good deal of the unhappiness of her later life was of her own making. And yet she was also brave, honest to the point of recklessness, loyal where she gave her loyalty, devoted to her husband through 40 years and beyond, capable of real love and real generosity, and possessed of a strength of mind and will that would have been remarkable in anyone, and was almost without parallel in a person of her age and station. She refused to flatter in a world built on flattery. She refused to be ruled in a world that gave women little choice but to be ruled. She spoke her mind to queens and dukes and ministers, and she paid the price for it, and she never once pretended to be other than she was. There is a hardness in her that is difficult to love, and there is a courage in her that is impossible not to admire. Perhaps the truest thing to say of her is that the very quality which raised her was the quality which ruined her, and that she was, from the first to the last, entirely of a piece. The fearless plain-speaking that had charmed a lonely princess was the same plain-speaking that drove away a weary queen. The relentless will that built a palace and a fortune was the same will that could not let a quarrel go or yield a single inch. She rose by being utterly herself, and she fell by being utterly herself, and she would not, one suspects, have changed a hair of it even had she known how it would end. She had answered a princess back as a girl, and she was still answering everyone back, in print, at the age of 82. The world had asked her to bend, again and again, and she had refused, again and again, to the very end of a life that lasted 84 years. Whatever else she was, Sarah Churchill was never anything but free, and so we leave her there, rest at last beside her great duke beneath the stone of Blenheim, the long quarrel stilled, the fierce will quiet, the whole crowded, brilliant, difficult life folded up and put away into history. The candles of that old court have all burned down now. The Queen and the favourite, Mrs. Morley and Mrs. Freeman, who loved each other so much and parted so coldly, are long since gone past all their anger into the same silence, and we may hope, on a quiet night such as this, that, wherever the dead are, the old friends have somehow found their way back to one another at last. If you have found something restful in these slow hours we have spent together, in this old story of a court long vanished and a woman now gone, then you are always welcome to subscribe and to stay close by for the next of these quiet evenings, whenever you should need one. There is no hurry in any of it. These histories will be here, waiting in the dark, ready to carry you off again to some other faraway place and time on another night when sleep is slow in coming. You need do nothing at all, but come back and let the story take you. And for now, there is nothing left to do but let yourself drift the rest of the way down into rest. Sleep well, stay warm, be kind to the people in your house, and I will see you in the next one. Good night.